On the 9th of February 2002, the Queen of England lost her sister, and the newspapers that had spent half a century treating that sister as a punchline finally ran out of jokes. Princess Margaret died at King Edward VII's Hospital in London a little after 6 in the morning, 4 days after a stroke, in the same week that should have opened the Queen's Golden Jubilee year. A woman who had spent the final years of her life largely out of public view after decades as one of the most photographed and most joked about figures in the country. The funeral came 6 days later, on the 15th of February, at St. George's Chapel in Windsor. Anyone who checked a calendar that week would have found something the palace never announced out loud. It was the 50th anniversary, to the day, of the funeral of their father, King George VI. Nobody at Buckingham Palace called that a coincidence, and nobody called it deliberate either. They simply let the date sit there, unexplained, the way the family had let so many other things sit unexplained for 50 years. That silence is the whole story in miniature. For most of the 20th century, the world was told a fairy tale about these two sisters, the steady one and the wild one, the dutiful queen and the tragic princess. Margaret gave up the man she loved so that Elizabeth's throne would never wear the taint of divorce, and in return, she got a decade of tabloid ridicule and a slow, well-lit collapse into cigarettes and gin. It is a good story. It has been told in documentaries, in prestige television, in 1,000 magazine retrospectives timed to royal anniversaries. It is also, according to the people who actually watched it happen from inside the household, a story that leaves out the one detail that would ruin the ending. Elizabeth did not simply lose a sister to grief and bad luck. Over 5 decades she learned, case by case, scandal by scandal, that she could not fully trust the one person in the world who had been closer to her than anyone else on earth. Not with secrets, not with timing, not, in the end, with the institution she had spent her entire life protecting. That is a very different claim than the one usually made about these two women, and it deserves to be treated carefully, rather than sensationally, because the record itself is careful. Nobody produced a memo in 1955 titled, "Reasons Not to Trust My Sister." What survives instead is a pattern, documented across decades by biographers with access to courtiers, private secretaries, and in a few cases the family itself. A pattern in which every major crisis of Margaret's adult life arrived at the worst possible moment for Elizabeth, and in which the palace's response, again and again, was not comfort, but containment. Two women raised in the same nursery by the same nanny, sharing the same childhood nickname games, ended their lives running what amounted to parallel operations. One operation was called the Monarchy, the other was called damage control. To understand how a bond that began in genuine, well-attested affection curdled into something closer to institutional wariness, you have to start decades before any of the scandal, back when there was no throne in the picture at all, back when Elizabeth was simply an older sister trying to keep her little sister out of trouble, because that habit, formed in a nursery on Piccadilly in the 1930s, never actually went away. It just changed scale. What began as a 6-year-old covering for a 2-year-old who had broken a vase became, 70 years later, a queen carefully managing what her government, her church, and her own household were permitted to know about a princess who had never quite accepted the terms of the life she had been born into. Elizabeth Alexandra Mary was born in April 1926 at her grandfather's house on Bruton Street in London, the first child of the Duke and Duchess of York, a couple nobody expected to sit on a throne. Margaret Rose followed 4 years later, in August 1930, born at Glamis Castle in Scotland, the ancestral seat of her mother's family. For the first decade of their lives, neither girl had the faintest institutional significance, beyond the ordinary significance of being minor royalty, a rung below the heirs presumptive, expected to grow up, marry reasonably well, and live out fairly private lives in the shadow of their uncle, who was expected to become king and eventually have children of his own, who would push both girls further from the line of succession rather than closer to it. Their childhood, by every account that survives it, was warm in a way that royal childhoods are not always warm. Marion Crawford, the young Scottish governess the family called Crawfie, was hired in 1932 and spent the better part of 2 decades in the girls' company, and her later account of those years, however much the family came to resent its publication, describes two sisters who were close in the ordinary, physical way that siblings are close when they share a nursery, a governess, and very few other playmates their own age. Elizabeth was serious, orderly, and by her own family's private description, something of a stickler for rules, even as a small child. Margaret was quicker with a joke, better at mimicry, restless in a way that made the household's routines feel, to her, like a cage that had been built around someone else's temperament and handed to her without adjustment. A line often attributed to their father from this period, that Lilibet was his pride and Margaret was his joy, has been repeated so often in popular accounts of the family that it has effectively become folklore, and it deserves to be treated with the same caution this video has applied to every other unverified quote in this story, since no contemporary written source has ever been produced to confirm George VI actually said it. Whether or not the specific words are real, the underlying division the line describes, one daughter defined by duty and the other by delight, tracks closely enough with everything else the documented record shows about how differently the two girls were perceived inside their own family, that the phrase has survived for a reason, even if that reason has more to do with narrative convenience than historical proof. One small formal detail from later in Margaret's life is worth noting here, out of chronological order, because it illustrates the same pattern of careful, permanent distance in miniature. Unlike some royal daughters in earlier centuries who received their own dukedoms or similar peerages in their own right, Margaret went to her grave holding no title beyond Princess Margaret, Countess of Snowdon, by marriage rather than by any grant from the crown itself. A woman who spent her entire adult life as the sister of the sovereign, without the sovereign ever creating a peerage specifically for her, the way monarchs both before and after have done for other close relatives. It was, on its own, an entirely unremarkable choice within the conventions of the modern monarchy, and no biographer has treated it as any kind of deliberate slight. It nonetheless fits, in a small structural way, into the same pattern this video has spent so long tracing, a family that kept finding small, procedurally ordinary ways to hold its most unpredictable member at exactly arm's length, never quite excluding her, never quite fully including her either. Then, in December 1936, the temperament of the entire family became a matter of state. Their uncle, King Edward VIII, abdicated the throne after less than a year as king, choosing marriage to Wallis Simpson, a twice-divorced American, over the crown itself. Their father, previously known simply as the Duke of York, a man with a bad stammer and no ambition for the job, became King George VI virtually overnight, and Elizabeth, 10 years old, became heir presumptive to the throne of the United Kingdom. This is usually told as Elizabeth's origin story, and it is, but it is just as much the origin of the specific shape Margaret's life would take for the following 7 decades. From the moment her father accepted the crown, Margaret's position in the family calcified into something she had not chosen and could not really change. She would always be the sister of the monarch. She would never be anything closer to the throne than that, and the family narrative that had just been forced upon all of them by their uncle's decision, the narrative in which personal desire is something you sacrifice for duty, in which marrying the wrong person can cost you a kingdom, became the moral architecture inside which both girls were raised from that point forward. It is difficult to overstate how much the abdication functioned as a kind of prophecy nobody in the family wanted to notice they were writing. 15 years later, one of George VI's own daughters would be asked to give up a man she loved for almost exactly the reason her uncle had been asked to give up his throne, and the family would treat the parallel as an inconvenience to be managed, rather than a lesson anyone had actually learned. The father both girls grew up idolizing paid for that unplanned reign with his own health, and the toll it took on him shaped the household his daughters were raised in more directly than either girl fully understood at the time. George VI was, by his own admission, and by the account of nearly everyone who worked with him, genuinely unsuited by temperament to the public demands of kingship, a shy, stammering man who found the constant exposure of monarchy genuinely agonizing, and who smoked heavily throughout a reign made considerably harder by a world war he had never expected to lead the country through. He died in his sleep in February 1952, at only 56 years old, worn down by the combined weight of lung disease, heavy surgery the previous year, and 15 years of a job his own brother's decision had forced onto him. Both daughters grew up watching that toll accumulate in real time, an unmistakable, close-range demonstration of exactly what the institution could cost a person who never wanted the largest share of it. A lesson Elizabeth appears to have absorbed as a case for even greater personal discipline, and one Margaret, by most accounts, absorbed instead as evidence that the whole arrangement extracted more than it ever gave back. The Second World War gave both girls a kind of protected, almost theatrical childhood at Windsor Castle, evacuated there for safety while their parents stayed largely in London, performing the labour of wartime monarchy under bombardment. They put on pantomimes in the castle's Waterloo chamber, raising money for wool for soldiers' comforts funds, productions of Cinderella and Aladdin staged with real theatrical ambition despite the wartime shortages, costumes improvised from blackout curtains, and whatever fabric the household could spare, Elizabeth playing the earnest prince to Margaret's scene-stealing comic relief, a division of theatrical labour that mirrored, a little too neatly, the division of public labour the two of them would inhabit for the rest of their lives. Elizabeth turned 18 in 1944 and pressed her parents to let her contribute more directly to the war effort, eventually training as a driver and mechanic with the Auxiliary Territorial Service, one of the only times in her life she would be treated, even briefly, as an ordinary young woman doing an ordinary young woman's job. Margaret, 4 years younger, was still a child through most of the war, too young for that kind of contribution, and spent the period being managed, protected, and increasingly aware that her older sister was being groomed for something enormous, while she herself was being groomed for very little, in particular, beyond charm. 5 years before that single unguarded night, the two of them had already appeared together publicly, for one of the first times in a form the whole country could hear, when Elizabeth, 14 years old, delivered a radio broadcast in October 1940, addressed to the children of Britain who had been evacuated away from their families for safety, a message of reassurance drafted with adult help but delivered in her own voice, and closed the broadcast by turning to her younger sister, waiting beside her at the microphone, so that Margaret could add a short goodnight of her own before the two of them signed off together. It was, in miniature, the very first public performance of the exact division of roles that would define the rest of both their lives, Elizabeth carrying the substance of the message, Margaret offering the warmer, more personal final touch, two sisters already being asked, without either of them fully understanding it yet, to play slightly different parts in the same national performance. There was one night, though, when the two of them briefly stood on equal footing, and it has become one of the most fondly remembered episodes in either woman's biography, precisely because it happened only once. On the night of Victory in Europe Day in May 1945, with London erupting in celebration below the palace balcony, where their parents stood before the crowds, Elizabeth and Margaret were permitted, with an escort of trusted officers, keeping a discreet distance, to slip out of the palace gates and lose themselves anonymously among the crowds thronging the streets outside, two teenage sisters walking through a jubilant city that had no idea it was standing shoulder to shoulder with its own future queen. Both women spoke about that night for the rest of their lives as one of the purest, least complicated memories either of them carried from the entire war, a few unrepeatable hours in which neither the curtsy nor the crown, nor any of the machinery that would soon reorganize their relationship around rank, had arrived yet to divide them. That asymmetry hardened after the war in a way that both sisters would spend decades living inside. In 1947, Elizabeth married Philip Mountbatten, a Greek and Danish prince who had renounced his foreign titles to become a British subject, in a wedding that briefly lifted the mood of a country still living under rationing. Margaret, 17 years old at the time, served as one of her sister's bridesmaids and watched her sister step into a life that had a shape, a partner, and a widely understood public purpose, while her own future remained undefined in every direction except the negative one. She was not going to inherit the throne. She was not, under any version of the family's plans, going to be given an independent household or a serious constitutional role. She was going to be the sister of whoever sat on the throne, for as long as that throne existed, and the only real question left open was what kind of woman she would choose to be inside that unchosen role. It is worth sitting with how strange that position actually is. Margaret was, by any objective measure, an extraordinarily privileged young woman, raised in palaces, dressed by the best couturiers in London, presented to society as one of its most sought-after young women. She was also, from the age of 6, a person whose entire adult identity had been pre-assigned to her by an accident of birth order, and the record of her adult life reads, again and again, like the record of someone testing the edges of a cage to see how far they actually extend. One episode from this period deserves attention in its own right, not because it involved any tension between the two sisters directly, but because it shaped, permanently, the family's institutional instinct towards secrecy, an instinct that would go on to govern nearly every decision made about Margaret in the decades that followed. Marion Crawford, the governess who had raised both girls from early childhood and who both sisters had genuinely loved, retired from royal service in the late 1940s and, with the family's initial and reportedly reluctant blessing, agreed to write a memoir of her years in the nursery, intended as a warm, harmless account of two ordinary childhoods lived inside an extraordinary household. The book, published in 1950, and titled The Little Princesses, turned out to contain exactly the kind of affectionate domestic detail the family had approved in principle and found, on publication, that they could not tolerate in practice. The reaction from the family was immediate and total. Crawfie, as they had always called her, was cut off from the household completely. Her subsequent letters reportedly returned unopened, her name turned, inside the family's own private vocabulary, into a verb, doing a Crawfie, shorthand for the specific betrayal of trading intimate royal access for public disclosure, a phrase that stayed in use inside royal circles for decades afterward. Margaret, only 20 years old when the book appeared, watched a woman who had functioned as something close to a second mother, banished from the family's life in a matter of weeks, over nothing worse than an affectionate, and by later standards, genuinely tame account of two children learning to ride ponies and put on Christmas pantomimes. The lesson that episode taught the entire family, a lesson Elizabeth in particular absorbed and never abandoned for the rest of her reign, was that even the mildest, most well-intentioned disclosure of private royal life carried a cost the institution was not willing to pay twice, and that lesson would shape exactly how much the family was willing to let anyone, including eventually Margaret herself, know about what happened behind palace doors. She did not have to wait long to find out. In February 1952, King George VI died in his sleep at Sandringham, worn down by years of illness that the family and the press had, by mutual and largely unspoken agreement, kept from full public view. Elizabeth was in Kenya with Philip, partway through a Commonwealth tour that had been designed to spare her ailing father the strain of the trip himself, and she learned she was queen while sitting in a treehouse called Treetops, watching wildlife at a game reserve, in what has to be one of the strangest settings in which any monarch in history has been informed of their own accession. She flew home immediately, and the machinery of state closed around her within days, courtiers bowing to a 25-year-old woman who had, by her own later description, spent her whole life being trained for a job she had never expected to start this early. For Margaret, 21 years old, and staying with her mother and sister through those first raw weeks of grief, the accession was not merely the loss of a beloved father, it was the moment the family's internal hierarchy, which had always existed in some informal sense, became formal, immovable, and permanent. Her sister was not simply older and more responsible anymore. Her sister was now the sovereign, the supreme governor of the Church of England, and the final constitutional authority over Margaret's own choices about marriage, about money, and eventually about almost everything else that mattered. Courtiers who had known both girls since infancy began, almost overnight, treating Elizabeth with a formality they had never extended to her as a child, and treating Margaret as what she had just become by definition, the sister of the Queen, a title with no salary attached, no defined duties, and no clear limit on how much of her own life it was now entitled to supervise. It was during those same raw weeks of mourning that the household arrangement which would soon consume the family's attention for 2 full years took its decisive shape almost without anyone noticing, though almost nobody involved recognized it as decisive at the time. Peter Townsend, who had served George VI as an equerry for years and had grown close to the whole family in the process, took charge of a great deal of the practical burden of managing the king's funeral and the difficult first weeks of transition that followed. And Margaret, grieving a father she had adored and suddenly aware of exactly how much her own position in the family had just changed, leaned on his steady, competent presence in a way that more than one household observer later described as the moment a long-standing friendly familiarity visibly deepened into something else. Grief has a way of accelerating intimacy that would otherwise have taken years to develop, and the same crisis that formalized the gap between the two sisters was, at almost the identical moment, drawing Margaret closer to the one man the establishment would spend the following 2 years trying to pull her away from. It took less than a year and a half for that supervision to be tested, and the test came from the one place a grieving 25-year-old monarch could least afford it, from inside her own household, and involving the one man Margaret actually loved. His name was Peter Townsend, a decorated Royal Air Force officer, whose credentials made him, by the standards of the day, almost impossible to dismiss as an unsuitable match on merit alone, whatever the constitutional problem his marital history eventually created. He had flown fighters through the Battle of Britain in 1940, was credited with shooting down enemy aircraft during the most desperate months of that campaign, and had been decorated for gallantry before he ever set foot inside a royal household, a genuine war hero in a country that, only a decade removed from the war itself, still took that word seriously. He had served as an equerry to King George VI since 1944, and had, over the following years, become something close to a member of the family in all but name, trusted enough that he was one of the men chosen to accompany the coffin at the king's funeral. He was also 16 years older than Margaret, married with 2 sons, and by 1952, in the process of a divorce from his wife, on grounds that made him, in the language of the day, the innocent party. None of that stopped Margaret from falling in love with him, and by most credible accounts, it did not stop him from falling in love with her either. What it did do was set the stage for the first genuinely public crisis of Elizabeth's reign, one that would surface for the entire world to see, at the one ceremony that was supposed to be the unqualified high point of her early monarchy. The coronation itself had been staged, deliberately, as a demonstration of continuity and youthful renewal after the long, grinding years of the war and its austere aftermath. The first British coronation, broadcast live on television, watched by a domestic and international audience, larger than any single event in the country's history to that point, though that broadcast very nearly did not happen at all. Churchill's cabinet initially opposed televising the ceremony, worried that the intimacy of the cameras would strip away the ritual's necessary mystery, and it took direct pressure from Prince Philip, who chaired the Coronation Commission himself and argued forcefully that the monarchy needed to be seen, rather than merely described, if it hoped to remain relevant to a rapidly modernizing post-war public, to reverse that early decision. Elizabeth had spent the months beforehand absorbing, in intensive and often exhausting sessions with constitutional advisors, clergy, and her own father's former private secretary, the full weight of what she was about to become, not merely a queen, but the supreme governor of the Church of England, a role that carried genuine theological as well as ceremonial obligations she took, by every account, with total seriousness from the very beginning of her reign. It is worth holding that context in mind for what happened next, because the woman who would spend the following 2 years working through her sister's marriage crisis was, at that exact moment, only weeks into internalizing the specific religious authority that would make the crisis so constitutionally fraught in the first place. It happened at the coronation itself, in June 1953, in front of Westminster Abbey, in front of cameras that were broadcasting the ceremony live for the first time in British history. Margaret herself held a formal, visible role in the ceremony that day, positioned prominently within the procession as the sovereign's sister, dressed in the same kind of ceremonial robes worn by the other senior royal women, a place of genuine honor within the ritual, rather than a peripheral one, which is part of what makes the moment that followed land as hard as it does. As the royal party emerged, Margaret was photographed reaching over to brush a piece of fluff from the uniform of Group Captain Peter Townsend, a small, entirely human gesture, the kind of casual intimacy that passes unnoticed 1,000 times a day between people who know each other well. It did not pass unnoticed this time. The American and European press, less deferential toward the British monarchy than Fleet Street had traditionally been, ran the story within days. The British papers, initially restrained by an unwritten code of royal discretion that still held some force in 1953, followed not long after, and within weeks the coronation of the new queen had already been overtaken, in public conversation, by the question of what her younger sister intended to do about a divorced commoner, 16 years her senior. It helps to understand exactly who Peter Townsend was before any of this happened, because his standing inside the household was not incidental to the crisis. It was part of what made the crisis so painful for everyone involved. He had flown as a fighter pilot during the Battle of Britain in 1940, credited with shooting down enemy aircraft during some of the most desperate weeks of the war, and he carried the kind of decorated, genuinely heroic wartime record that made him, by the time he joined the royal household as an equerry in 1944, exactly the sort of man the family trusted instinctively and without reservation. George VI had come to rely on him personally in the king's final, illness-shadowed years, and both princesses had grown up around him as a fixture of royal life long before anyone in the family had cause to think of him as anything other than a trusted member of the household staff. That trust is precisely why his divorce, when it came, did not simply end his usefulness to the family the way a scandal involving a stranger might have. It forced the people who had trusted him for a decade to treat him, almost overnight, as a problem to be managed, and several accounts describe the king's own private secretary as personally uncomfortable with how abruptly a man the family had genuinely valued was recast as an obstacle the moment his relationship with Margaret became public. What followed has been told and retold so many times, in so many competing versions, that the challenge for anyone trying to get it right is not finding information, but sorting through which pieces of it are actually established fact, and which pieces have hardened into legend through 50 years of retelling. Here is what the record actually supports. Under the Royal Marriages Act of 1772, still in force at the time, Margaret required the sovereign's formal consent to marry, since she was under 25. That act itself had been passed nearly 2 centuries earlier, for reasons that had nothing to do with Margaret, and everything to do with an earlier generation's royal scandal, after 2 of King George III's own brothers had contracted marriages the Crown considered unsuitable, and its entire purpose from the beginning had been to give the sovereign a formal veto over exactly the kind of match Margaret was now proposing, a law built for one family crisis being invoked, nearly 200 years later, to manage another. Elizabeth, as head of state, and, more decisively, as Supreme Governor of the Church of England, was placed in a genuinely difficult constitutional position, because the Church of England at that time did not permit the remarriage of divorced persons whose former spouse was still living, even an innocent party like Townsend. The cabinet, led first by Winston Churchill and then by Anthony Eden, took the position that the marriage should not go forward, not necessarily out of personal disapproval, but out of a calculation about what the country and the Commonwealth, several of whose parliaments would also have had to consent, were prepared to accept so soon after the abdication crisis that had defined the family's entire adult lives. There is a detail about Eden specifically that rarely makes it into shorter tellings of this story, and that deserves to be stated plainly, because it is the kind of irony that would be dismissed as too neat if a novelist had invented it. Eden himself had divorced his first wife and remarried in 1952, making him, at the exact moment his government was advising the palace that a divorced man's past made him unsuitable for royal marriage, a divorced man who now sat at the head of that same government. Nobody in a position of authority ever formally raised the contradiction in public at the time, and Eden's own remarriage did not stop him from pursuing the policy his cabinet had settled on, a fact that says a great deal about how much this entire affair was governed by institutional necessity rather than by any consistent moral logic applied evenly to everyone involved. Group Captain Townsend was reassigned to a diplomatic posting in Brussels in the summer of 1953, a transfer that biographers across the political spectrum have treated as a deliberate attempt to separate the couple and let time do what direct refusal could not. The man widely credited, or blamed, depending on the account, with pushing that transfer through was Tommy Lascelles, the Queen's own private secretary, and a figure who had served the royal household since the reign of George V, a man for whom institutional continuity was close to a religious principle. Lascelles is reported, in several separate biographical accounts of the period, to have told Townsend directly that he must be either mad or bad to imagine the marriage could be allowed to happen. A line that has been quoted often enough in the decades since, that its precise wording has almost certainly drifted from whatever was actually said in that room, but whose substance nobody involved in the episode ever seriously disputed. Townsend's own memoir of the affair, published years later, describes a young queen who struck him as genuinely sympathetic to the couple's situation, but who never once, in his recollection, offered anything beyond that sympathy, no active intervention, no use of the personal authority a new and popular monarch might plausibly have spent on her sister's behalf. Whether that restraint reflected a young woman correctly deferring to constitutional advice she was bound to follow, or a young woman choosing not to spend political capital on a fight she privately preferred to see settled without her fingerprints on the outcome, is a question the surviving record simply does not answer with certainty, and every honest account of this episode has to leave it standing exactly that unresolved. The Commonwealth dimension of the crisis, often compressed into a single passing reference in shorter accounts, mattered a great deal to how the whole affair was handled behind the scenes. Because Elizabeth reigned not only over the United Kingdom, but separately over Australia, Canada, and several other Commonwealth realms, following the logic established by the Statute of Westminster, any formal marriage requiring full royal sanction risked becoming entangled with the governments of those countries as well, each with its own domestic political sensitivities about divorce, religion, and the dignity of the crown they shared. That wider constitutional tangle gave the cabinet in London one more concrete argument for delay beyond its own domestic concerns. An argument about coordinating consent across an entire Commonwealth rather than simply managing British public opinion. And it is one of the less discussed reasons the establishment treated the affair with as much institutional gravity as it did. This was never simply a family matter, or even simply a British matter, but a question touching the constitutional arrangements of half a dozen countries at once. The Church's own position was represented most forcefully by Geoffrey Fisher, Archbishop of Canterbury, throughout the entire affair, a man who had crowned Elizabeth at the coronation only weeks before the Townsend story broke, and who held, without any real ambiguity, that remarriage after divorce, while a former spouse was still living, stood in direct conflict with Christian teaching, as the Church of England then understood it. Fisher's position was not a personal vendetta against Margaret or Townsend specifically, and biographers who have examined his private correspondence from the period describe a man who found the whole affair genuinely painful to adjudicate, caught between real sympathy for two people in love and a theological conviction he was not willing to bend for a princess any more than he would have bent it for anyone else in his diocese. That consistency, however sincerely held, was cold comfort to Margaret, who experienced it not as principled theology, but as one more voice in a chorus of powerful men, her own sister's archbishop among them, explaining to her exactly why the life she wanted was not going to be permitted. Townsend's own 2 years in Brussels were, by his own later account, close to unbearable. A decorated war hero, effectively exiled from the country, and the woman he loved by a government that never formally admitted it was punishing him for anything, since on paper his transfer was simply a routine diplomatic posting. He and Margaret were permitted only limited contact during that period, mostly by letter, and the distance the palace had engineered did exactly what it had been designed to do, giving the relationship 2 years to either burn out on its own, or, if it somehow survived, to arrive at its final reckoning only once Margaret had turned 25 and the legal requirements had shifted in her favour. Townsend's own 2 young sons from his first marriage remained in England throughout this period. Another quiet cost of the whole affair that rarely makes it into shorter retellings. A father separated simultaneously from the woman he loved, and, for stretches of time, from his own children. Sacrifices made in service of a relationship the government had already made clear it did not intend to let succeed. It very nearly worked as a war of attrition against the relationship itself. That it did not fully succeed That Townsend returned to a Margaret whose feelings had not measurably cooled only made the final capitulation in October of 1955 harder for both of them, since neither could tell themselves the ending had been inevitable on the merits rather than manufactured by 2 years of engineered separation. What is genuinely contested, and what the family itself has never resolved in any single authoritative account, is how much of this was Elizabeth's own doing, and how much of it was policy imposed on her by a government and a church establishment she was constitutionally bound to follow. Christopher Warwick, who wrote an authorized biography of Margaret with the cooperation of people close to her, has suggested that Elizabeth was privately far more sympathetic to her sister's situation than the official machinery around her allowed her to show, and that the decisive obstruction came less from the Queen herself than from courtiers and ministers who saw the marriage as an unacceptable risk to the institution barely a year into the new reign. Other accounts are less generous, arguing that Elizabeth, whatever her private feelings, made no serious effort to use the considerable informal authority a young and popular new monarch actually possessed to protect her sister's happiness, and that her silence functioned, whatever its intent, as consent to the machinery that was crushing the relationship on her behalf. Both readings can be true at once, and that is precisely the point that gets lost when this story is flattened into pure fairy tale. A woman can be sympathetic and still be an instrument of the outcome. A queen can love her sister and still, through inaction dressed up as constitutional propriety, deliver the verdict her government wanted delivered. For 2 years the two of them waited, kept apart by distance and by an unofficial understanding that nothing would be settled until Margaret turned 25, in August 1955, at which point she would no longer need the sovereign's consent under the Act. Only the consent of Parliament, if she wished to retain her royal rights and income. Consent that would need to be sought within 12 months. It was, by design or by accident, an arrangement that gave the family 2 more years to hope the whole problem would simply dissolve on its own. And when it did not dissolve, when Townsend returned to London in the autumn of 1955, and the couple resumed seeing each other in full view of a press pack that had by then abandoned all restraint, the government finally forced the issue to a head. What makes this period particularly uncomfortable to look back on is how little the public pressure the government claimed to be responding to actually matched public opinion as it was measured at the time. Newspaper polling conducted during the crisis found a clear majority of ordinary Britons in favor of letting Margaret marry the man she loved, whatever the Church's formal doctrine on the matter, which meant the establishment case against the marriage was never really a case about what the country would tolerate. It was a case about what the Church hierarchy, the cabinet, and a handful of senior courtiers had decided was proper, dressed up in the language of public duty and Commonwealth opinion, because that language was easier to defend than simply admitting the decision belonged to a small, unelected circle of men who had already made up their minds. Margaret was told, in terms that biographers describe as blunt, even by the standards of 1950s establishment communication, that a marriage to Townsend would require her to renounce her rights of succession, her royal income, and very likely her ability to remain in Britain in any recognizable version of the life she had always known. On the last day of October 1955, she issued a statement, drafted with the help of the very man she was giving up, that has been quoted in almost every account of her life ever since. She said she had been aware that a civil marriage might have been possible if she renounced her rights of succession, but that mindful of the Church's teaching on the indissolubility of Christian marriage, and conscious of her duty to the Commonwealth, she had resolved to put those considerations before any others, and that she had reached the decision entirely alone, without any prompting from Group Captain Townsend. The announcement itself broke on a Monday, and by most newspaper accounts of the following days, the public reaction split cleanly between sympathy for Margaret personally and genuine surprise at how completely the government's position had prevailed over what opinion polling had suggested people actually wanted. Crowds gathered outside Clarence House in the hours after the statement was released, in numbers large enough that several papers described the scene as closer to a vigil than the celebratory send-off a genuinely voluntary decision might have drawn, and commentary in the days that followed leaned heavily on the language of sacrifice and mourning rather than relief, a tone that undercut, almost immediately, the statement's own claim that Margaret had reached this conclusion entirely on her own and at peace with it. That final line, that the decision was hers alone, is the one detail nearly every subsequent biographer has treated with the most skepticism, because it strains credibility that a 25-year-old woman arrived unassisted at a decision that so precisely tracked what the church, the cabinet, and the palace had spent 2 years steering her toward. It also happens to be the line that did the most lasting damage to the relationship between the two sisters, because it placed the entire weight of the sacrifice on Margaret's own shoulders, while quietly erasing everyone else's role in making that sacrifice, including the role, however constrained, that her own sister the Queen had played. Margaret spent the following decades being publicly celebrated as a paragon of duty for a decision that, in private, she came to describe in far less flattering terms, and more than one biographer with access to her later reflections has recorded her expressing something closer to regret and resentment than the serene self-sacrifice the official statement had described. She had given up the life she wanted so that her sister's early reign would not be complicated by a fight over church doctrine and constitutional precedent, and in the years that followed, the thanks she received from that same sister amounted, in practice, to very little beyond continued and steadily tightening supervision. The immediate public reaction to the statement, in the days after it was released, gives a useful sense of just how completely the sacrifice narrative took hold, before anyone had time to question it. Newspapers across Britain and much of the Commonwealth ran the story as front-page news for several consecutive days, framing it overwhelmingly as an act of noble self-denial rather than a young woman being maneuvered into a decision by forces well beyond her control. And letters of public sympathy reportedly arrived at the palace by the thousand in the weeks that followed, a genuine outpouring that suggests the sacrifice narrative was not simply manufactured by the press, but reflected something the public actually wanted to believe about its own royal family at that particular moment, a family still rebuilding its moral authority after the abdication less than 2 decades earlier. That immediate, overwhelming public embrace of the sacrifice story is precisely what made it so difficult to dislodge later, once biographers began assembling the more complicated private record this video has drawn on throughout. The public had already decided what kind of story this was within days of the announcement, and reversing that collective judgment decades later has proven far harder than establishing it in the first place ever was. This is the wound the rest of this story grows out of, and it is why the thesis at the center of this video is not that Elizabeth hated her sister, or that Margaret was some kind of villain, or that either woman was lying about the affection between them, which by every account remained genuine until the day Margaret died. It is something colder and, in its own way, sadder than a simple falling out. From 1955 onward, Elizabeth learned a lesson she never fully unlearned. Whatever Margaret wanted, the institution's needs would come first, and that meant Margaret's private life would be treated, by definition, as a risk that had to be managed, rather than a happiness that could simply be trusted to work itself out. Over the following 4.5 decades, that lesson would be tested again and again, through a marriage that collapsed in public, through an affair that detonated at the worst possible moment in the Queen's own calendar, through decades of parliamentary complaints about money that Margaret herself did very little to quiet, and through a pattern of behavior inside the family's own private gatherings that courtiers, staff, and eventually biographers would describe, with a consistency that is hard to dismiss as coincidence. As the behavior of a woman, the rest of the family had learned to watch carefully, rather than confide in freely. Every single one of these episodes will be covered in full over the course of this video, in the order they happened, with the sourcing laid out honestly, including the places where the historical record itself is divided, and where certainty simply is not available. What you are about to see is not the fairy tale about the Queen and her tragic sister. It is the far more uncomfortable and far better documented story of 2 women who loved each other their entire lives, and who also, over the course of that same lifetime, ran out of the one thing that a bond like theirs actually needs in order to survive at full strength, which is trust. If that is the kind of story you want told properly, without the sentimentality that usually smooths over the sharpest edges of it, stay with this video through to the end, because it only gets more complicated from here. And subscribing to this channel means you will not miss the documentaries still to come on the family whose private history keeps turning out to be stranger than the official version anyone was ever told. The renunciation was supposed to close the subject. It did not. What it actually did was hand the palace a new problem, which was what to do with a princess who had just performed, in front of the entire Commonwealth, the single most public act of romantic self-denial in the family's living memory, and who now had to be given something resembling a life. Margaret spent the second half of the 1950s as one of the most photographed young women in the world, celebrated for a sacrifice she had not entirely chosen, courted by a long list of eligible men who mostly bored her, and increasingly drawn to a very different social circle than the one her sister moved in. Where Elizabeth's world was built around county families, horses, and the steady rhythms of court life, Margaret gravitated toward theatre people, photographers, jazz musicians, and the loose, glamorous edge of 1950s Chelsea bohemia, a world her sister found genuinely difficult to understand and, by several accounts, mildly alarming. The newspapers, having spent 2 years treating her as a tragic heroine, spent the years immediately afterward doing the opposite, tracking her through an unbroken string of romances, with an appetite that made the earlier Townsend coverage look restrained by comparison. She was linked, at various points across the later 1950s, to Billy Wallace, an old friend from her debutante years generally understood within the family's own circle to be the closest thing to a settled, approved match available to her, an engagement that dissolved before it was ever formally announced after Wallace's own indiscretions became difficult to overlook. She was linked as well to a rotating cast of other eligible men, aristocrats and society figures, whose names filled the same gossip columns that had turned her renunciation into a national morality play only a year or two earlier, and the whiplash between those two treatments, saintly sacrifice 1 year, restless bachelorette the next, set a pattern the press would apply to her for the rest of her life. She could not simply be a woman living her own life in whatever manner suited her. She had to be a story with a clear moral shape, dutiful or reckless, saintly or scandalous, and the same publications that profited from casting her as one were always ready to recast her as the other the moment her behavior gave them a new angle to sell. Alongside the romances the press found so irresistible, Margaret spent these same years building the beginnings of a genuine public role, even without any formal constitutional duty requiring her to do so. She took on patronages that would occupy her for decades, becoming president of the Royal Ballet, a role she held with real seriousness rather than as a ceremonial afterthought, and extending her involvement into organizations ranging from the Girl Guides to the Royal College of Nursing to the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, a portfolio that, taken together, represented hundreds of engagements across her lifetime, even if it never generated the kind of press coverage her romantic life did. It is a pattern that runs through nearly every difficult royal figure this channel has ever covered, that the actual working record, the hospital visits, the fundraising dinners, the site inspections nobody photographs because nothing scandalous happens at them, simply cannot compete for column inches with a single photograph of a princess in swimwear on a private beach, and the imbalance in coverage this created did as much as any of Margaret's own choices to shape how she would eventually be remembered. She also carried out a genuine share of the family's overseas representational work across these decades, touring extensively on the Commonwealth's behalf through the Caribbean, Africa, and Asia at various points, engagements that required exactly the same stamina, protocol fluency, and diplomatic tact expected of any working royal on a state visit, even though Margaret herself held no formal diplomatic standing beyond her family relationship to the crown. Foreign Office staff who accompanied her on several of these tours have described a woman who took the substance of the work seriously, even when the press covering the same trips back home focused almost entirely on what she wore or who she was seen with, a private professionalism that rarely survived contact with the domestic news cycle waiting for her on return. It is worth pausing to note that the years between the renunciation and the Snowdon marriage were not, whatever the tabloids preferred to emphasize, simply years of parties and courtships. Margaret held a genuine, if never especially prominent, slate of official patronages during this period, including long-standing involvement with the Girl Guides movement she had belonged to as a child, work with the Royal Ballet at a formative period in that company's post-war development, and patronage of several children's welfare charities that continued for decades with very little press attention, precisely because that kind of unglamorous, repeated charitable work rarely generated headlines the way a nightclub appearance did. This unglamorous half of her public life would go on being real and largely unremarked upon for the rest of her time in public life. Running in parallel with the more sensational chapters this video has spent most of its runtime on, a genuine record of service that the more dramatic version of her story tends to crowd out entirely. That pressure to fit a moral shape rather than simply live a private life extended, before long, to the family's own attempt to manage its public image on television. And the most revealing single episode in that effort deserves a place in this story, even though it involves both sisters equally, rather than either one alone. In 1969, the palace cooperated with the production of a documentary film called Royal Family, granting an American and British television audience unprecedented access to the everyday private life of the entire household. Elizabeth, Philip, Margaret, and the children all included, eating meals together, relaxing at Balmoral, behaving, ostensibly, the way the family actually behaved when cameras were not present. The film was a sensation on its first broadcast, watched by tens of millions of people who had never before seen the monarchy presented in anything other than fully ceremonial terms, and it worked exactly as intended in the short term, humanizing a family that had begun to seem remote to a rapidly modernizing Britain. Within a matter of years, though, the family itself came to regret the decision, concluding that the film had given away far more of the institution's mystery than any temporary boost in public affection was worth, and the palace withdrew the film from further broadcast without any real public explanation, restricting access to it so tightly that for decades afterward it existed largely as rumor and bootleg clips rather than something the public could simply watch again. The lesson the family drew from that experiment, that opening the curtain even briefly could not be undone once the public had seen behind it, arrived only a few years before Margaret's own marriage began generating exactly the kind of unscripted, uncontrollable public exposure the 1969 documentary had been designed to forestall, and courtiers who lived through both episodes have described the family's post-1976 instinct toward containment as, in part, a direct response to having already learned, the hard way and on its own terms, just how much damage an uncontrolled glimpse behind the curtain could do. It was in that world that she met Anthony Armstrong Jones in the mid-1950s, a talented and ambitious society photographer, with no title and no fortune of his own, the son of a barrister, and a woman who would later become a countess through her second marriage. By the time the two of them met, Armstrong Jones had already built a genuinely successful independent career, photographing actors, writers, and society figures for magazines and newspapers, a working professional in a creative trade, rather than an aristocrat drifting through inherited privilege. And that earned, self-made quality was, by several accounts, a real part of his appeal to a woman who had spent her entire life surrounded by men whose only qualification was birth. He was, on paper, everything the establishment had just spent 2 years insisting Margaret could not have. He was not a member of the aristocracy, he had no inherited wealth, and his own family life had been unconventional enough that some courtiers privately worried about the precedent of a royal marriage to a man from that kind of background. And yet, unlike Townsend, he had one advantage that mattered more than any of that. He had never been married, so there was no Church of England prohibition standing in the way, no cabinet debate required, no need for anyone to invoke the Act of 1772 beyond the ordinary formality of the sovereign's consent, which Elizabeth granted without the years of public agony that had defined the Townsend affair. The engagement was announced in February 1960, and the wedding took place in May of that year at Westminster Abbey, the first royal wedding broadcast live on television, watched by an audience estimated in the tens of millions, a spectacle that briefly made Margaret and her new husband the most modern, most photographed couple in Britain. Elizabeth herself created the Earldom of Snowdon for her new brother-in-law shortly before the birth of their first child, a deliberate act of formal elevation that gave Armstrong Jones a title of his own, rather than leaving him simply as Margaret's husband, with no rank to pass on to their children, a generous gesture that also, not incidentally, brought a man with no prior connection to the aristocracy, fully inside the same peerage system his wife's family had spent centuries occupying, smoothing over on paper a class distinction that had generated real private unease within parts of the household when the engagement was first announced. There is a detail from that wedding day that rarely makes it into the sanitized version of this story, and it deserves to be stated plainly rather than treated as scandal for its own sake, because it says something real about the circle Margaret had chosen. Among the guests in the Abbey that morning was Camilla Fry, a close friend of the bride, and, by that point, 8 months pregnant. The identity of the child's father would go on to become one of the more persistent open questions in the social history of that circle, a question that has never been definitively resolved in public, and that this video will not pretend to resolve either, beyond noting that it hung over Margaret's new marriage from literally its first morning, in a chapel full of people who all knew a great deal more than they were prepared to say to the cameras outside. The original choice for best man never made it to the altar, and the reason why says a great deal about how much scrutiny even the smallest details of this wedding attracted. Jeremy Fry, a wealthy industrialist and Armstrong Jones's own cousin, had been the couple's first choice, only for newspapers to discover, in the weeks before the ceremony, a decades-old conviction connected to his private life that the palace judged too damaging to survive public disclosure so close to the wedding day. Fry withdrew without any public explanation at the time, and the role passed to another friend instead, a small scandal folded so completely into the larger occasion that it barely registered against everything else the wedding generated in the press. It carries a strange resonance given who else was connected to that same family. Fry was married to Camilla Fry, the 8 months pregnant guest, already noted among those seated in the Abbey that morning, which meant the paternity question hanging over her unborn child and the withdrawal of her own husband as best man were unfolding, entirely by coincidence, inside the very same wedding party at the very same time. The wedding itself, for all the modernizing symbolism attached to it afterward, was staged with every bit of the ceremonial weight Westminster Abbey had given the coronation 7 years earlier. Margaret wore a tiara that had belonged to the Ormond family, purchased for the occasion rather than inherited, a small but telling detail for a bride who had spent her entire life surrounded by other people's heirlooms, and who wanted, evidently, at least one object of real weight that was entirely her own on the day she finally got to choose her own husband. The couple honeymooned aboard the royal yacht Britannia, sailing through the Caribbean on a 6-week voyage that took them past Mustique for the first time, the island where Margaret would later be given land as a wedding gift from her friend Colin Tennant, and where, within a decade and a half, the marriage that began on that same honeymoon voyage would effectively end. Few details capture the arc of this marriage more precisely than that single geographic coincidence, a honeymoon route that happened to pass directly through the place where the relationship would eventually be photographed falling apart. The marriage began, by most contemporary accounts, as a genuinely happy one, and for the first several years, it did real work for the monarchy's public image. Armstrong Jones, created Earl of Snowdon in 1961, brought a new visual language to royal photography and helped modernize the family's public presentation at a moment when Britain itself was changing quickly around them, and he turned his own camera on his wife constantly throughout their years together, producing an enormous private archive of informal, unguarded portraits of Margaret that stand in sharp visual contrast to the stiff, formally posed royal photography of earlier decades. Images that likely did more to shape the public's visual sense of who Margaret actually was than any single event covered in this video. The couple had 2 children, David in 1961 and Sarah in 1964, and for a period in the middle of the decade, they were, by any external measure, a genuine royal success story, culminating in a highly publicized tour of the United States in November 1965 that is still remembered as the high watermark of Margaret's public standing. She was received in America with a warmth and glamour her sister, more reserved by temperament and more constrained by the formality of a state visit, had never quite generated in the same way, and for a brief window it looked as though Margaret had found, on her own terms and without her sister's help, a version of public purpose that suited her. The tour included a private dinner at the White House with President Lyndon Johnson, who by several accounts found Margaret's directness and dry humor genuinely refreshing compared to the more careful diplomatic company he usually kept, and American newspapers spent weeks comparing her favorably to Jacqueline Kennedy as a new kind of transatlantic-style icon, a comparison Margaret is said to have enjoyed rather more than the palace, which watched its own reserved, dutiful queen being implicitly outshone in the American press by her supposedly lesser sister, with a discomfort that several courtiers from the period later admitted to. The itinerary carried the couple beyond Washington as well, through California and into the film industry's own social circles, where Margaret's mixture of royal rank and genuine wit made her a natural fit for a Hollywood crowd more accustomed to manufactured celebrity than the real, hereditary variety, and society photographers spent the tour competing for images that could run alongside the breathless American coverage, comparing her, favorably and often, to the most glamorous women in the country she was visiting. That success came with a cost the family had not fully priced in, and the cost was resentment, some of it Margaret's own, and much of it directed at her from outside the family entirely. The same 1965 tour that made her an international celebrity also made her an unusually visible target for a political argument that had been building in Britain for years, an argument about how much taxpayer money the monarchy actually deserved, and specifically about how much of that money was going to family members who, unlike the Queen herself, held no constitutional office and performed no head of state functions. The Labour backbench Member of Parliament Willie Hamilton became the loudest and most persistent voice in that argument, and Margaret, with her glamorous lifestyle, her expensive travel, and her marriage to a man whose own income depended on his royal connections as much as his photography, became his favourite and most durable target. For more than a decade, well into the 1970s, Hamilton returned again and again to the same argument in Parliament and in the press, that Margaret was drawing a substantial income from the civil list, while providing very little in the way of formal public duty in return, and that the arrangement amounted to a kind of state-funded celebrity rather than genuine constitutional service. Elizabeth, whose own popularity depended in part on the perception that the monarchy earned its public funding, watched her sister become the single most convenient argument available to critics of the institution she had spent her entire adult life protecting. And there is no serious biographer who has failed to note how much friction that repeated, highly public association caused inside the family, whatever was or was not said between the two sisters directly. The argument reached its most formal expression in the early 1970s, when Parliament convened a select committee to review the entire structure of civil list payments across the family, a process that forced the government to put an actual figure, debated openly on the floor of the House of Commons, on the value of Margaret's continued public support. The committee's eventual settlement kept Margaret's payments in place, but only after weeks of public argument in which her own name was invoked, repeatedly, as the example critics reached for first, ahead of cousins, ahead of in-laws, ahead of nearly anyone else on the list, except occasionally the Queen Mother herself. It is worth pausing on how strange that singling out actually was, because Margaret was neither the most expensive member of the extended family to maintain, nor the one who did the least in the way of official engagements over the course of her life. She undertook hundreds of public duties across her lifetime, serving as patron or president of dozens of organizations, and by the account of people who worked alongside her in those roles, she took at least some of that work seriously. What made her different, and what made her the target Hamilton kept returning to for over a decade, was visibility of exactly the wrong kind, a public profile built as much around mystique and nightclubs as around hospital visits and charity galas, a profile that handed critics a much easier story to tell than the dry business of comparing actual duty rosters across the family. Male members of the family with comparable or even lighter public workloads rarely drew the same sustained parliamentary fire in this period, a pattern several commentators have connected less to what any of them actually did with their time than to a broader willingness, common enough in British public life across this entire era, to hold a visibly independent woman to a different standard of scrutiny than the one applied to her male relations, a pattern that would repeat itself, in sharper and more damaging form, when Diana entered the family a decade and a half later. Underneath the public argument about money, the marriage itself was coming apart out of public view, and the private accounts that have since emerged, largely through biographers who spoke to friends, staff, and in some cases the children themselves once they were adults, describe a household that had curdled from genuine partnership into something closer to open warfare, conducted through small, deliberate cruelties. Snowdon is widely reported, across multiple independent biographies, to have compiled a written list of things about Margaret that irritated him, an inventory of complaints ranging from trivial habits to deeper character judgments, and to have left it where she would find it, a gesture that friends of the couple have described as calculated humiliation rather than accidental carelessness. Both partners are documented, across separate and largely independent accounts, to have conducted affairs outside the marriage through the late 1960s and into the 1970s, and the household at Kensington Palace is described by more than one visitor from that period as tense, in a way that guests could feel within minutes of arriving, a marriage being performed for the cameras and dismantled everywhere else. The apartment itself, known within the palace as Apartment 1A, was a large, formal residence spread across multiple floors, spacious enough that a husband and wife determined to avoid each other could plausibly do so for days at a stretch without either one technically moving out, a piece of architecture that inadvertently made the slow physical separation of the marriage considerably easier to sustain than it would have been in a smaller home. Friends who visited the apartment during these years have described small, telling domestic details: doors kept deliberately closed between connecting rooms that had once stood open, staff carefully briefed on which topics were safe to raise with which spouse, dinner parties that ran on two entirely separate registers of conversation, depending on who was in the room, all of it adding up to a household that had learned to perform functionality for guests, while operating, in practice, as two increasingly separate lives, sharing a single address. Several biographers who interviewed household staff from this period independently arrived at nearly identical descriptions of that same pattern, a level of corroboration across otherwise unconnected sources that makes the general shape of the marriage's collapse, if not every specific anecdote attached to it, about as well established as anything in this entire story. Snowdon's own life after the divorce followed a trajectory almost entirely disconnected from the family whose image he had once helped modernize. He continued working as a professional photographer for decades afterward, maintaining a long-running association with the Sunday Times and building a body of documentary and portrait work that critics have generally judged on its own artistic merits, rather than as an afterthought to his royal marriage. Photographing subjects ranging from disabled children to fellow public figures with a technical skill that had never really been in question, even at the height of the marriage's collapse. He remarried twice more after Margaret, and by the time of his own death in 2017, decades removed from the mystique photograph and the divorce that had once made him one of the most talked-about men in Britain, obituaries generally treated his marriage to Margaret as one chapter in a longer working life, rather than the defining fact of his existence, a kind of gradual rehabilitation his former wife, whose own public identity never really escaped the shadow of that same marriage, was never afforded in quite the same way. It was into this already fragile situation that Roddy Llewellyn arrived, a gardener and aspiring musician, 17 years younger than Margaret, whom she met in the early 1970s, through mutual friends, and grew close to over a period of some years, initially in ways that could plausibly be described as ordinary friendship, before the relationship deepened into something considerably more serious. For a while this was contained, as much of the earlier drift in the marriage had been contained, within a social circle that understood the rules and largely kept its silence. What changed everything was a single photograph taken on the private Caribbean island of Mustique, where Margaret had owned a house since the 1960s, on land given to her as a wedding gift by her friend Colin Tennant, later Lord Glenconner. In February 1976, a British tabloid published a picture of Margaret and Llewellyn together on that island, in swimwear, unmistakably a couple, and the story exploded across the front pages of every major newspaper in the country within days. The paper that ran the photograph, the News of the World, had obtained it from a freelance photographer working with a long lens from a boat offshore, the same paparazzi method that would later be turned on Diana with far more brutal consequences. And the image itself showed nothing more scandalous than two people standing close together on a beach, a fact that did nothing to slow the speed with which the British press turned it into a national scandal about a princess vacationing with a man half her husband's age while her marriage collapsed at home. Colin Tennant, whose own social circle had effectively created the mystique retreat that made the whole episode possible, later described the island's tight-knit community of aristocrats and artists as having operated for years on an understanding that what happened there stayed there, an understanding the freelance photographer's long lens ended in a single afternoon. Satirical magazines joined the tabloids within days, and the nickname that stuck to Llewellyn in the popular press for years afterward, the Toy Boy, entered the wider British vocabulary largely through this one story, a linguistic legacy that has long outlived most people's memory of the actual details of the affair itself. The island itself deserves a sentence of its own here, because Margaret's house there, which she and Snowdon eventually built and named Les Jolies Eaux, was never simply a private retreat. It was the physical center of an entire social world Tennant had spent years assembling. A rotating guest list across the 1960s and 70s that included figures from theatre, music, and the aristocracy, who valued the same discretion the photograph destroyed. And Margaret's presence at the center of that world for decades is part of why the photograph did so much damage. It did not simply expose an affair. It exposed the existence of an entire private universe the palace had never fully accounted for in its own risk calculations. A universe with its own rules, its own regulars, and its own decades-long tolerance for exactly the kind of behavior that would have ended a lesser royal's public standing overnight. The clearest single demonstration of just how far that universe had drifted from ordinary royal decorum came several years before the Llewellyn photograph, in 1970, when Colin Tennant staged an elaborate 40th birthday celebration for Margaret on the island, an event still discussed among people who study the period for its sheer theatrical extravagance, complete with a costumed entrance and entertainment that would have been unthinkable at any function connected to the Queen's own household on the mainland. Guests over the years included figures from the worlds of rock music and film who had nothing whatsoever to do with royal circles in any conventional sense, a level of cultural cross-pollination that made Mystique feel, to the people who spent time there, like a different country entirely from the one Margaret's sister governed, which in the most literal sense of taxation and legal residence, it eventually became for parts of the year. Roddy Llewellyn himself weathered the scandal considerably better than Margaret did in the years that followed, eventually building a public career as a gardening writer and television presenter, marrying in the 1980s, and largely avoiding the tabloid attention that had made his name a household word for one very public year in the middle of the decade. A quieter second act than the woman whose life his own had briefly and expensively been tangled up with. The timing of that explosion is the detail that separates this episode from just another scandal in a long list of them. The detail that shows the deeper pattern of this story most clearly. 1976 sat directly in the run-up to the Queen's Silver Jubilee, a celebration scheduled for the following year that had been planned, for months already, as a national morale event, a chance to remind an economically battered Britain, deep in the middle of a punishing decade of inflation and industrial unrest, why the monarchy still mattered. Every element of that celebration depended on public goodwill, on the sense that the royal family represented something stable and worth honoring at a difficult national moment, and Margaret's affair detonated directly into the middle of the run-up to that event, giving Fleet Street a story about royal dissipation and marital collapse to run alongside every earnest piece of Jubilee planning coverage the palace's own press office was trying to place. Courtiers from that period, quoted in multiple later biographies, described genuine anger inside the household, not sympathy dressed up as concern, but real, undisguised frustration at a member of the family who appeared, at the worst possible moment, to be actively undermining the very image the institution needed intact. The Jubilee itself went ahead the following June exactly as planned, and by most measures, it succeeded magnificently, drawing enormous street crowds across the country in a display of public affection for the monarchy that surprised even some of the palace's own planners after the grim economic mood of the preceding several years. Street parties reportedly numbered in the tens of thousands across Britain that summer, a bonfire and beacon chain lit across the country on the night of the official celebration, and Elizabeth toured the country extensively that summer, and the warmth of the reception did a great deal to repair the institution's standing after a difficult decade. What the official coverage of that summer rarely dwelled on, because the palace's own press machinery made sure it did not have to, was the fact that the Queen's own sister had spent the months immediately beforehand at the center of a separation announcement and a swirl of newspaper speculation about her private life. Timed close enough to the Jubilee that the two stories briefly shared front pages before the palace's messaging apparatus, working exactly as the post-1976 containment instinct had trained it to, pushed the coverage of Margaret's marriage back into the entertainment and gossip pages and kept the Jubilee itself on the front page where the institution needed it. It was, in miniature, the clearest possible demonstration of what 4 decades of managing Margaret had actually been in service of the entire time. Not personal disapproval, not even primarily financial concern, but the protection of exactly this kind of moment, a national celebration the family could not afford to let a family scandal overshadow. Margaret and Snowdon formally separated in March 1976, weeks after the Mystique photograph broke, and divorced in May 1978, becoming the first senior member of the British royal family to obtain a divorce since the 16th century reign of Henry VIII, a fact that every single newspaper covering the story made sure to mention, and a fact whose irony deserves to be stated as plainly as the record itself states it. 23 years earlier, this same woman had been told that a divorced man's past made him constitutionally unmarriageable to her, that the church over which her own sister presided as supreme governor could not countenance the union, that duty required her to give up the one man she had genuinely loved rather than risk the precedent. Now she herself stood at the center of a divorce, initiated from within her own marriage, conducted in the full glare of the same press that had once celebrated her sacrifice as a model of royal duty. The Church's position on divorce had shifted only slightly in the intervening decades, not nearly far enough to erase the discomfort of the parallel, and Elizabeth, once again supreme governor of that same church, now had to sit with the fact that her own sister had become the very kind of precedent the family had spent the 1950s trying to prevent. The divorce itself proceeded through the civil courts with a procedural ordinariness that stood in almost comic contrast to everything the family had put itself through 2 decades earlier to avoid exactly this outcome: a formal petition, a settlement dividing property and arranging custody of 2 children who were by then teenagers, and a decree finalized in a matter of months rather than the years of constitutional agonizing that had once attended the mere possibility of a Townsend marriage. That contrast was not lost on contemporary commentators, several of whom noted in print at the time that the same family which had once treated a hypothetical marriage to a divorced innocent party as a threat to the constitutional order was now processing an actual royal divorce through entirely ordinary legal channels without any comparable crisis of state, proof, if any more were needed, that the extraordinary machinery deployed against Townsend had always been a matter of institutional choice, rather than genuine necessity. That parallel would only grow sharper with time, in a way neither sister lived to see resolved, but which belongs in this story anyway, because it closes the loop the Townsend affair opened. Elizabeth's own son Charles, the nephew Margaret had grown so close to in her final years, married a divorced woman himself in 2005, Camilla Parker Bowles, in a civil ceremony, followed by a service of blessing at Windsor, conducted with the Church of England's full and public cooperation, the same institution that had once required Margaret's total renunciation of the man she loved, over precisely this question. The Church had spent the intervening half-century gradually revising its own doctrine on remarriage after divorce, adapting by increments to a Britain in which divorce itself had become common rather than exceptional, and by the time Charles needed the accommodation, the Church was able and willing to provide it, in a way it had never been willing to provide it for his aunt. Margaret did not live to see that wedding, having died 3 years earlier, and no biographer has ever established what she would have made of watching the same institution that ended her own engagement later clear a path for her nephew's remarriage to a divorced woman a generation later. What the record does support is simpler and, in its own way, harder to sit with. The rule that shaped the defining sacrifice of Margaret's early life was never permanent. It was simply inconvenient to change quickly enough to help her. In her own final decades, according to more than one biographer who spoke with people close to her in that period, Margaret revisited the Townsend affair periodically in private conversation, and the tone she reportedly used had shifted considerably from the composed language of the 1955 statement. Friends have described her returning to the subject unprompted, decades on, in ways that suggested it had never fully settled into the past for her, the way most old heartbreaks eventually do, less a wound that had healed than one she had simply learned to carry without letting it show in public. She is reported, by people who knew her across those later years, to have felt that history had been considerably kinder to the institution's version of events than to her own, that the sacrifice everyone else got to admire from a comfortable distance was one she alone had actually been required to live inside for the rest of her life, a distinction that mattered enormously to her, and that the popular retelling of her story, even now, still tends to flatten away. Snowdon himself outlived the marriage by nearly 4 decades, and the shape his own later life took complicates the straightforward villain role he is sometimes assigned in retellings of this story. He continued working as a professional photographer of real and lasting stature, remained a working member of extended royal circles in an informal sense for the rest of his life, and became, somewhat unexpectedly given his own earlier reputation for cruelty inside his marriage, a genuine and effective advocate for disability access in Britain, a cause that grew out of personal experience with family members and friends living with disabilities, and that led him to help redesign building access standards, still referred to informally in some circles, by his own name, decades later. He remarried twice more after Margaret, had further children, and died in 2017, at the age of 86. A long life that gave him considerably more time than Margaret got to revise, in the public record if not necessarily in private memory, how his own contribution to their shared history would be remembered. The 2 children caught in the middle of that collapse grew up largely outside the tabloid glare their parents had generated for so long, and their later lives are worth noting briefly, because they suggest the marriage's damage did not simply repeat itself down the generations, the way so much else in this family's history tended to. David, who inherited his father's earldom on Snowdon's death in 2017, built a career in furniture design and later chaired the auction house Christie's, maintaining a public profile defined by steady professional competence rather than any of the scandal that had surrounded his parents. Sarah became a painter, exhibited her work publicly under her own name, and married the actor Daniel Chatto, and both children, by every account available, remained close to their mother for the rest of her life, a detail that complicates any reading of Margaret purely as a source of chaos, rather than also, within her own home, a source of real maternal warmth. Whatever the marriage had cost the 2 of them as children watching their parents' public disintegration, neither grew up to repeat the pattern in any way the historical record has documented, which is its own understated argument that the household Margaret ran, whatever its very public failures as a marriage, managed to protect its children from the worst of what surrounded them. There is no evidence in the historical record that Elizabeth ever said, out loud or in writing, anything as blunt as "I told you so," and every biographer who has looked closely at the sisters' relationship during this period agrees that Elizabeth's public and private conduct toward Margaret throughout the divorce was supportive rather than punitive. What changed, according to courtiers and household staff, quoted across multiple independent accounts, was something quieter and more lasting than a single confrontation. The palace's press operation, the household's internal planning around Margaret's public appearances, and the family's own informal calculus about what Margaret could be trusted to handle without generating another crisis, all of it tightened measurably after 1976. Margaret's role in official events became more carefully managed. Her public statements, always minimal, became rarer still. The pattern that would define the rest of her life inside the family had fully arrived, a pattern in which the operative question, whenever Margaret's name came up in palace planning meetings, was no longer "what does Margaret want to do," but "what is Margaret likely to do, and how much of it can be contained before the newspapers get hold of it." Elizabeth's own private reaction to each fresh piece of bad news about her sister followed a pattern nearly every member of her staff who has written or spoken about working for her describes in almost identical terms across 5 decades of otherwise very different memoirs, a composure so total that aides often could not tell, from her face or her tone in the minutes after being briefed on some new crisis, whether the news was mildly embarrassing or genuinely serious. That composure was not indifference, whatever it might have looked like from across a desk, but it did mean Margaret rarely got the one thing a sibling in real distress usually wants most from family: an unguarded, visibly emotional response that confirms the relationship still runs deeper than protocol. What she got instead, reliably and for decades, was competence. A sister who would handle the practical consequences of whatever had just happened, without ever quite letting Margaret see how much any of it had cost her personally to absorb. If you have made it this far into the story of two sisters whose bond was tested by every one of these crises in turn, you already understand why this video exists. Because the popular version of this relationship, the one that gets repeated in glossy retrospectives every time there is a royal anniversary to mark, simply cannot survive contact with the actual timeline. This channel exists to walk through timelines exactly like this one in full, without smoothing over the parts that complicate the fairy tale. And if that is the kind of history you actually want, take a moment now to subscribe, because the second half of this story, covering the decades of careful information control that followed, the family gatherings courtiers still talk about, and the final years that brought these two sisters back together right at the very end, is still ahead, and it is, if anything, harder to watch than everything you have just seen. To understand exactly what changed inside the family after 1976, it helps to go back to the very first adjustment the sisters ever had to make, because it sets the template for everything that followed. In the weeks after George VI's death in February 1952, household staff at Buckingham Palace and Sandringham had to be reminded, sometimes more than once, that the woman they had known since childhood, as the younger of the two princesses, was now, constitutionally, owed a curtsy by her own sister. Margaret is reported by more than one household source to have found this adjustment genuinely difficult, in a way that went beyond simple etiquette, because it formalized, in a single physical gesture repeated at the start of nearly every private family meeting for the rest of their lives, a hierarchy that had previously existed only in the abstract sense that Elizabeth would one day be queen. Now it was immediate. Now it applied to breakfast at Sandringham as much as to state occasions at the palace. Whatever affection remained between the two of them, and by every account a great deal did remain, it now had to be performed inside a structure of formal deference that no ordinary sibling relationship ever has to accommodate. And biographers who have studied the family closely have consistently identified that early, unglamorous adjustment, the curtsy at breakfast, as the true starting point of the imbalance that would define the rest of their adult lives far more than any single scandal ever did. It is worth pausing here to note the one notable exception to everything this section is about to describe, because leaving it out would tilt the picture further than the record actually supports. Margaret served for decades as one of the Councillors of State, a small group of senior royals legally empowered to carry out certain official duties on the sovereign's behalf whenever Elizabeth was abroad or otherwise unavailable. A formal constitutional role that required the Queen's own continued confidence to maintain, and that Margaret held without interruption for most of her adult life. It was a limited power, exercised only rarely and always under strict legal constraint, but it was real, and it meant that even at the height of the family's caution toward her, Elizabeth never moved to strip her sister of the one piece of actual constitutional authority available to her, a small, easily overlooked fact that complicates any reading of this relationship as pure institutional exile dressed up in family language. That imbalance hardened into something closer to active management once the Snowdon divorce and the years of Willie Hamilton's civil list campaign had made clear, beyond any remaining doubt, that Margaret's private conduct carried direct public consequences for the institution, but the instinct itself long predated 1976, and it is worth tracing it back to its true origin before continuing the story forward. Richard Colville, who served as the palace's press secretary from 1947 through 1968, spanning the entire Townsend affair and the first 8 years of the Snowdon marriage, was so consistently hostile to press inquiry of any kind that journalists of the period nicknamed him the Abominable No Man. A press secretary whose entire operating philosophy held that the royal family's business was categorically not the public's business, full stop, regardless of how much appetite the public had already demonstrated for exactly that information. Colville's approach worked, more or less, for as long as the British press retained enough institutional deference to accept being told no without pushing back, which is roughly what happened through most of the Townsend affair itself, when domestic newspapers held their silence for weeks after the American press had already broken the story. That deference collapsed steadily across the 1960s, and by the time Margaret's marriage began generating headlines in the 1970s, the flat refusal strategy Colville had relied on for 2 decades no longer worked on a press corps that had grown far more aggressive and far less willing to accept a palace non-answer as a final word. What replaced it, gradually and without any single announced change in policy, was the more sophisticated containment approach this video has already documented at length, an approach built less around refusing all information and more around managing which information reached the public, when, and through which channel, a strategic evolution rather than a genuinely new instinct, since the underlying goal, protecting the institution from unwanted disclosure, had been exactly the same since Crawfey's manuscript first taught the family how much a single uncontrolled account could cost them. Part of that more sophisticated approach involved formalizing relationships with a small group of trusted correspondents who came to be known as the Royal Rota. Journalists granted privileged access to official engagements in exchange for a broadly cooperative editorial line, a system that gave the palace real influence over the framing of routine coverage, even as it remained powerless to stop the tabloids willing to operate entirely outside that system, exactly the kind of outlet that had run the Mystique photograph and would later chase Diana's car through a Paris tunnel. Margaret's own relationship with the Rota correspondents was, by several accounts, cooler and more guarded than Elizabeth's, a reasonable response from a woman whose experience of the British press had rarely given her much reason to extend trust. But that same guardedness meant she had fewer sympathetic outlets willing to push back when the tabloids outside the system came after her, leaving her more exposed to exactly the kind of coverage this video has spent so long tracing than a warmer relationship with the Rota might otherwise have provided. From the mid-1970s onward, private secretaries at the palace, men whose entire professional function was to protect the sovereign's public standing, began treating Margaret's public schedule the way a risk manager treats an exposed position, something to be hedged rather than simply supported. Her engagements were reviewed with particular care. Statements attributed to her, always rare to begin with given how little she spoke publicly compared to other working members of the family, were vetted more closely than those of almost anyone else in the household. This was not cruelty, and it was not, by any credible account, driven by personal animus on Elizabeth's part. It was the entirely rational response of an institution that had been burned, repeatedly and expensively, by a family member whose personal choices kept becoming national news at moments the palace could least afford it, and the person responsible, in the final accounting, for deciding how much rope to give that family member was, always, the Queen herself. The clearest single illustration of why that caution existed came in 1984, during a private dinner in Chicago, hosted as part of a visit to the United States. According to multiple contemporaneous press reports and later biographical accounts, Margaret made remarks about Chinese people that were picked up by American journalists present at the event and reported internationally within days, remarks widely characterized in the press at the time as racially offensive, and the story generated a genuine diplomatic complaint from the Chinese government, arriving at exactly the kind of moment the Foreign Office dreads, a minor royal turning a goodwill visit into an international incident through nothing more than an unguarded comment at a private dinner that had not stayed private. The palace's response, consistent with the pattern that had been building since 1976, was damage control rather than public defense, a muted effort to let the story die down without either confirming or elaborating on what exactly had been said. Margaret herself never publicly apologized in any statement that survives in the historical record, and the episode passed, as most of her controversies eventually did, without any lasting formal consequence beyond another entry in the growing private ledger, kept by courtiers and eventually by biographers, of incidents that reinforced the same underlying judgment. Margaret could not be fully trusted to represent the family in unscripted settings, and every unscripted setting she was allowed into carried a small, real risk that Elizabeth's own household would end up managing the fallout. That risk extended well beyond diplomacy into money, an area where Margaret's habits did little to help her own case. Household staff and biographers alike have described a woman who, despite the civil list income that Willie Hamilton had spent a decade attacking in Parliament, ran her own finances with a looseness that occasionally required intervention from family or friends. She maintained an expensive household at Kensington Palace, employed a substantial domestic staff for a woman with no independent constitutional role, travelled frequently and comfortably to Mustique and elsewhere, and by several later accounts found herself, in the final years of her life, genuinely short of the funds required to sustain the lifestyle she had grown used to, a fact that friends have said embarrassed her, and that the family, by most accounts, absorbed without fanfare, rather than allowed to become public in the way the civil list debates of the 1970s had been public. It is a small detail set against everything else in this story, but it fits the same pattern precisely. Wherever Margaret's own judgment was left unsupervised, from diplomatic small talk to household budgeting, the record shows a repeated need for someone else, usually the institution her sister headed, to step in unobtrusively and prevent a private lapse from becoming a public one. None of this happened in isolation from the ordinary texture of family life, and it is worth being honest about what that texture actually looked like, because the popular image of two remote, permanently composed royal sisters obscures just how much friction played out in perfectly ordinary domestic settings. Household staff who worked for both women across multiple decades have described, with a consistency that spans several independently written memoirs, two very different personalities operating inside the same family structure. Elizabeth, by nearly every account, was disciplined, punctual, and famously reluctant to cause a scene, a woman who treated her own feelings as something to be managed privately rather than displayed. Margaret was the opposite in almost every particular. She was witty in a way that could turn cutting without warning, a gifted mimic who could reduce a room to laughter by imitating a guest who had left 5 minutes earlier, and by multiple accounts, genuinely demanding of the deference her royal status entitled her to, even from close friends, even in the most casual private settings, a demand that struck more than one observer as strange coming from a woman who had, in her own marriage, deliberately chosen to step outside the aristocratic world that usually enforced that kind of formality. She was frequently late. She smoked heavily throughout her adult life, a habit that would eventually catch up with her health in a serious way, and she drank steadily, favoring, according to more than one account from people who knew her socially, a particularly strong whiskey and soda that she was said to prepare and re-prepare with a consistency friends found almost ritualistic. None of this made her a villain, and none of it erases the genuine wit, warmth, and loyalty that people who loved her describe just as consistently. It does explain, in very concrete terms, why a sister whose own temperament ran toward order and restraint might, over the accumulated weight of decades, come to treat family gatherings involving Margaret as occasions requiring a certain amount of careful stage management rather than simple, unguarded relaxation. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from loving someone you cannot fully predict, and everything in the documented record of Elizabeth and Margaret's middle years points toward exactly that kind of exhaustion settling into their relationship. It did not extinguish the affection. Every biographer who has examined the two women's private correspondence, their holidays together at Balmoral and Sandringham, and the accounts of staff who watched them together in unguarded moments, agrees that the two sisters remained genuinely close, that Elizabeth continued to seek her sister's company voluntarily rather than merely tolerating it out of obligation, and that Margaret, for all her frustrations with the constraints of her position, never showed any real desire to distance herself from a sister she had known and loved since before either of them could remember a world without the other in it. What changed was not the love. What changed was the degree of unguarded trust Elizabeth was willing to extend, a trust that had been tested by the Townsend affair, tested harder by the Snowdon marriage's collapse in full public view, tested harder still by a decade of parliamentary attacks over money, and tested finally by a diplomatic incident that made clear even a private dinner was not necessarily safe. By the time both women reached late middle age, the relationship had settled into a permanent, unspoken arrangement, close in private, carefully managed in public, loving and watchful in exactly the proportions the previous 4 decades had taught Elizabeth were necessary. A useful comparison, and one that clarifies exactly what set Margaret apart, sits right next door in the same family. Princess Anne, the Queen's only daughter, occupied a role with real structural similarities to Margaret's, a working royal without any prospect of the throne, subject to the same press interest, the same civil list scrutiny, the same institutional expectations. For roughly 2 decades from her 1973 wedding to Mark Phillips through the late 1980s, Anne largely avoided the sustained public crisis that had defined Margaret's entire adult life, building instead a reputation, deserved by most accounts, as one of the hardest-working members of the family, a reputation that shielded her from exactly the kind of parliamentary attack Willie Hamilton had levelled at her aunt for years. That changed in the early 1990s, when Anne's own marriage collapsed, and she became, in 1992, the first child of a reigning British monarch to divorce since Margaret herself, remarrying the following year in a Church of Scotland ceremony that sidestepped the Church of England's continuing restrictions entirely. The comparison matters because it shows the family's institutional caution was never really about Margaret personally, whatever it might have felt like from inside her own experience of it. It was about behavior, sustained over time, in full public view. Anne earned 2 decades of comparatively light scrutiny through 2 decades of comparatively disciplined public conduct, and lost some of that credit the moment her own private life became a headline. Exactly the same trade every adult member of this family has been required to make since the day the abdication crisis first taught them all what the alternative could cost. The Queen's younger son offers the opposite lesson, and it belongs here precisely because it complicates any simple theory that the family's scrutiny fell evenly or fairly. Prince Andrew spent decades drawing considerably less sustained parliamentary and press attention than Margaret ever did, despite a public record that included his own business associations drawing periodic criticism long before the far more serious allegations that eventually consumed his public role entirely in the 2010s. Several commentators who have studied the family's uneven pattern of scrutiny across generations have pointed to exactly this contrast: a male heir's son facing years of comparatively gentle press treatment for conduct that would very likely have ended a female relative's public standing far sooner. A pattern that fits uncomfortably alongside everything this video has already documented about how much harder Margaret was held to account than the men around her ever were. It would be a mistake to let the accumulated weight of scandal, money troubles, and diplomatic embarrassment stand in for the whole picture, because the people who actually worked alongside Margaret in the causes she cared about describe someone genuinely different from the figure who dominates the tabloid record. She served for decades as a serious patron of the arts, particularly ballet, and figures within that world, including senior members of the Royal Ballet itself, have credited her with real, sustained advocacy that went well beyond the ceremonial ribbon-cutting expected of a royal patron. She was an early and committed supporter of what became the English National Ballet, involved herself personally in fundraising efforts for institutions she cared about, and maintained friendships across the arts world, from theatre to music, that had nothing to do with royal obligation and everything to do with a genuine, lifelong love of the creative world. Her own constrained position had never quite let her join as a full participant. She was also, by every account of people who spent private evenings with her, a genuinely skilled amateur pianist who enjoyed performing show tunes and popular songs for guests after dinner, a talent she had cultivated since childhood, and one that gave her, in informal settings, a form of public performance entirely her own, unmediated by the press, unscripted by any courtier, simply a woman at a piano, entertaining people she liked. Friends who knew her outside the glare of the tabloids describe a woman capable of real warmth, of showing up for people in private crises without any expectation of public credit, of a sharp, self-deprecating humor about her own position that rarely made it into print because it did not fit the narrative the press had already decided to run. Anne Glenconner, Colin Tennant's wife and one of Margaret's own ladies in waiting for decades, later wrote her own memoir of that friendship, describing a woman whose private generosity towards staff and friends, going through genuine hardship, stood in stark contrast to the public image of a demanding, difficult princess. An account all the more notable for coming from someone who had also witnessed Margaret's temper and her exacting standards at closer range than almost anyone else alive. None of that erases the pattern this video has spent the last hour documenting. It complicates it, in exactly the way any honest account of a real person's life should be complicated. And it is worth saying plainly that the woman Elizabeth had learned to manage as a risk was, to the people who actually loved her, also someone worth loving without qualification, a fact Elizabeth herself, whatever her institutional caution, never once seems to have forgotten. The caution itself, though, did not disappear, and it is worth noticing how directly it shaped the family's later handling of every subsequent member who threatened the same kind of unpredictable exposure Margaret had generated for 4 decades. Courtiers and journalists who have covered the family since the 1980s have described an informal, unwritten set of instincts inside the household, sometimes referred to as a Praetorian Guard, built around the core priority of protecting the sovereign's image above almost any other consideration, including the personal happiness of individual family members. Diana, Princess of Wales, arriving into the family in 1981 as a shy 19-year-old, with no template for the institution she was marrying into, found Margaret one of the few people in the household willing to offer anything like genuine friendship in her early years. A kinship, 2 women who each, in their own way, had discovered how little room the institution left for a personality it had not planned for. That friendship curdled later, for reasons that belong to an entirely different story than this one. But the instinct Margaret had spent decades teaching the palace to apply to her, contain first, sympathize second, would be applied again, with even higher stakes, to Diana herself within a decade, and again after that to Sarah Ferguson, and again to other members of the family whose private lives kept colliding with the institution's need for a stable public face. Margaret was not the first royal to embarrass the family, and she would certainly not be the last, but the specific playbook the palace used for managing an unpredictable family member, the careful vetting of appearances, the reflexive minimizing of disclosure, the private absorption of financial and personal difficulty rather than public acknowledgement of it, was refined, case by case, scandal by scandal, on her. The same playbook was still visibly in use decades after Margaret's death, when Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's own departure from official royal duties in early 2020 produced an almost identical institutional response. Careful statements, minimized public comment, containment managed through structure rather than confrontation, proof that the specific instinct this video has spent so long tracing back to 1955 outlived not only Margaret herself, but the entire generation of courtiers who first built it around her. This household arrangement was never a simple 2-person equation, and leaving out the 2 figures who shared those same houses for decades would flatten a picture that was, in reality, considerably more layered. Prince Philip's relationship with his sister-in-law has been described by people who observed it firsthand as a genuine but frequently combative friendship, built around a shared appetite for sharp, teasing humor that occasionally tipped over into something closer to open sparring at the dinner table. Disagreements the rest of the family reportedly learned to let run their course, rather than referee. Philip is on record, in more than one interview across his long life, expressing real affection for Margaret, alongside an unmistakable exasperation with what he regarded as her wasted potential, a combination that mirrored, in a blunter and less diplomatically careful register, exactly the tension running underneath Elizabeth's own, more carefully managed feelings toward her sister. The family's 3rd major figure through all of this, the Queen Mother, complicates the picture further still. Widowed in 1952, at the same moment her elder daughter became queen, she lived for another 50 years, dying only weeks after Margaret herself. And by numerous accounts, she indulged her younger daughter in ways that occasionally put her at odds with Elizabeth's own instinct toward caution, defending Margaret's choices to courtiers, smoothing over disputes before they reached the Queen directly, and by some accounts, shielding Margaret from a measure of consequence that a stricter household might otherwise have imposed. Whether that maternal protection helped Margaret or simply delayed a reckoning she would eventually face anyway is a question biographers continue to debate, but its effect on the sister bond at the center of this story is not really in dispute. For as long as the Queen Mother lived, Margaret had a second, softer center of gravity inside the family to appeal to whenever Elizabeth's caution felt like rejection, and that alternative allegiance, however loving in its own right, did nothing to close the distance the rest of this story has spent so long documenting. Whatever distance existed between the two sisters directly, Margaret occupied a genuinely warm and largely uncomplicated role with the next generation, serving as godmother to several of her nieces and nephews, and building, in particular, the close bond with Charles this video has already touched on. Household staff have described a woman who, whatever her reputation for demanding formality from adults, was considerably more relaxed and playful with the children in the family, an aunt who told better jokes than anyone else at the table, and who several of her nieces and nephews have separately described, in adulthood, as one of the more genuinely fun presences in an otherwise fairly formal childhood. That capacity for warmth with the youngest members of the family sits alongside everything else this video has documented without contradicting any of it. A reminder that the woman the institution had learned to manage as a risk was, in the rooms where the stakes were lowest, often simply a beloved aunt, doing her best to make a fairly rigid childhood a little less rigid for the children living through it. The family's annual Christmas gathering at Sandringham, which both sisters attended for nearly every year of their adult lives barring only the most serious illness or scheduling conflict, offers a useful final snapshot of how these two very different temperaments coexisted inside the same household ritual for decades. Staff who worked the holiday for multiple generations describe a fixed, almost liturgical schedule of church attendance, formal meals, and present opening on Christmas Eve, rather than Christmas morning, in the continental fashion the family had followed since Victoria's own German relatives introduced it, a schedule Elizabeth maintained with the same discipline she brought to everything else in her public and private life. Margaret's presence inside that schedule was, by every account, reliably the loosest thread in an otherwise tightly run occasion. The family member most likely to arrive last, stay up latest, and say the thing at dinner that made the table go quiet for a beat before someone, often Elizabeth herself, moved the conversation along. Decades of that exact pattern, repeated Christmas after Christmas at the same table in the same house, did as much to shape how the family actually experienced Margaret day to day as any of the scandals this video has spent so long documenting. A low-grade, entirely private, entirely affectionate exasperation that never once threatened to keep her off the guest list. Nowhere is the contrast between the two sisters' temperaments easier to see in concrete, documented detail than in the private rhythms of family life at Balmoral and Sandringham, houses where the family gathered every year for weeks at a stretch, and where staff who served multiple generations of the household have, over the decades, provided a strikingly consistent picture of how differently the two sisters actually lived inside the same walls. Elizabeth kept, by every account, an almost monastic private schedule relative to her public image, rising early, walking her dogs, attending to state papers delivered daily even on holiday, and retiring at a reasonable hour, regardless of what entertainment the rest of the household had planned. Margaret kept something close to the opposite schedule, staying up long after the rest of the family had gone to bed, expecting friends and sometimes staff to remain awake and attentive to her company well into the early hours, a habit multiple former staff members have described as genuinely exhausting for anyone required to accommodate it. Smoking steadily through a long cigarette holder that became almost as recognizable a personal signature as any single piece of jewelry she owned, a habit indoors and at the dinner table long after the rest of the family had largely abandoned the practice in shared spaces. Guests invited to Balmoral during weeks when Margaret was in residence have described being warned, informally and in advance, about the etiquette expected around her specifically, rules that had less to do with her actual constitutional rank, which after 1952 never rose above what any sister of the monarch would hold, and more to do with a personal insistence on the trappings of royal deference that friends found difficult to reconcile with a woman who had deliberately married outside the aristocracy and spent decades cultivating an image of bohemian informality. Guests were expected to remain standing until she sat, to wait for her to initiate conversation in certain settings, and to observe small courtesies that even some of her own relatives found excessive, given the actual scope of her formal role. None of this made her a difficult person by any absolute standard. It made her a person whose demands on the people around her, in the most private and unguarded settings the family had, were consistently higher than her institutional position by that point actually required. And every one of these small frictions, multiplied across decades of shared holidays, fed into the same broader pattern of a sister the family had learned to manage, rather than simply relax around. The information control that defined so much of Margaret's later life extended, by multiple credible accounts, into the substance of family matters themselves, and not merely into press strategy. As Charles and Diana's marriage began visibly deteriorating through the second half of the 1980s, courtiers close to the Queen have described a household that grew increasingly careful about how much of the unfolding crisis was shared, even among family members whose discretion had, by that point, been tested and found wanting on more than one prior occasion. Margaret, despite her own early closeness with Diana, was not treated by the Queen's private office as a reliable channel for sensitive family information during this period, and several accounts describe a pattern in which major developments inside the Wales's marriage reached Margaret through the same newspapers that reached the general public, rather than through any advance briefing from her sister's own household. This is, on its own, a small and almost bureaucratic detail, the kind of internal information routing that most organizations handle without anyone outside ever noticing. Inside a family, among two sisters who had shared a nursery, a governess, and the whole of their childhoods, that same routing decision reads as something considerably more pointed, a structural expression, repeated in dozens of smaller forms across 4 decades, of exactly how much Elizabeth had come to trust her sister with the institution's most sensitive material, which by the 1980s was measurably less than she trusted almost anyone else close to her. There is a version of this story, popular among some of Margaret's more sympathetic biographers, that reads the entire pattern in reverse, arguing that the family failed Margaret far more than she ever failed the family, that a woman with genuine talent, wit, and capacity for public service was systematically starved of any real constitutional role after 1952, and then blamed, for the rest of her life, for the restless, sometimes self-destructive behavior that boredom and marginalization predictably produced. Christopher Warwick, whose authorized biography drew on Margaret's own cooperation and that of her closest friends, makes exactly this case with real force, arguing that the institution created the conditions for Margaret's unhappiness and then treated the resulting unhappiness as evidence that she could not be trusted, a closed loop that left her very little room to prove otherwise. This reading deserves to be taken seriously rather than dismissed, because it is supported by real evidence, by the genuine absence of any defined public role for Margaret after her sister's accession, by the well-documented frustration Margaret herself expressed, across multiple interviews and to multiple friends over the decades, about spending her entire adult life, as what she once reportedly described, in a line repeated by more than one biographer, as the family's spare part. Both readings, the one that holds Margaret responsible for a lifetime of self-inflicted scandal, and the one that holds the institution responsible for wasting a genuinely talented woman, can be true at the same time, and the honest position, the one this video has tried to hold from its opening minutes, is that Elizabeth's caution toward her sister was neither pure institutional cruelty nor a simple, deserved response to Margaret's own failings. It was the accumulated residue of both, layered decade after decade, until neither sister could fully separate the love between them from the damage each new crisis kept adding to the account. That arrangement held, more or less intact, through the 1980s and into the 1990s, a period in which Margaret's own health began to intrude on the family's careful equilibrium in ways no amount of press management could fully control. The heavy smoking that had defined her adult life since her 20s finally caught up with her in 1985, when doctors removed part of one of her lungs in an operation the palace confirmed only in the barest possible terms, a pattern of minimal disclosure that would repeat itself, with escalating stakes, for the rest of her life. She continued smoking after the surgery, a decision friends have described as characteristic of a woman who had spent her entire life resisting instructions about how she was supposed to behave. And by the time the 1990s gave way to the new millennium, the accumulated toll of decades of cigarettes and steady drinking had begun to show in ways that were increasingly difficult for even the most careful press office to keep entirely out of public view. Whatever difficulty Margaret's demanding streak created for casual acquaintances, the people who worked for her over long stretches of her life describe a rather different pattern, one worth setting against the household anecdotes already covered in this video. More than one lady-in-waiting and household member stayed in her service for decades rather than years, a retention rate not automatically guaranteed by royal employment alone, and several who eventually wrote or spoke about their time with her described a woman who, whatever her demands in the moment, remained genuinely loyal to staff who had earned her trust, intervening personally on their behalf in ways that went beyond what her position technically required. That loyalty ran in both directions, in a manner that some of the more scandal-focused retellings of her life leave out entirely, a reminder that the same personality capable of the small cruelties recorded elsewhere in this story was also capable of an old-fashioned, almost feudal sense of obligation to the people who spent their working lives around her. One coda from those years deserves its own moment before the decline of Margaret's final decade begins, because it closes a loop this video opened at the very start. Peter Townsend, the man whose love for Margaret had set the entire chain of events in this story into motion back in 1953, had gone on, after the renunciation, to build a life that had almost nothing further to do with the family that had kept him apart from her. He married a Belgian woman, Marie-Luce Germagne, in 1959, settled in France, wrote several books including his own memoir of his years in royal service, and by most accounts, lived out of the spotlight and without public bitterness for the rest of his life. He and Margaret are reported, by more than one biographer, to have met again decades later, an encounter arranged discreetly and conducted without press knowledge, two people well into middle age, sitting across from each other, with 40 years of separately lived history between them. Townsend died in June 1995, and Margaret, by the accounts of friends who knew both of them, was said to have been genuinely affected by the loss, a reaction that suggests whatever else the intervening decades had buried under Snowdon, Llewellyn, and every scandal in between, the original wound from 1955 had never fully closed. Before the strokes and the physical decline that would define Margaret's last years, one more crisis tested the family, and it deserves its place here because Margaret's own reaction to it says as much about her as anything else in this story. In August 1997, Diana, Princess of Wales, died in a car crash in Paris, and the week that followed produced the single largest outpouring of public grief the British monarchy had faced in living memory, a groundswell so intense it forced Elizabeth into the one genuinely reactive public relations crisis of her entire reign, summoning her back to London from Balmoral and requiring a live television address to a country that had, for several extraordinary days, seemed almost to be turning against the family's traditional reserve. Margaret, by several friends' later accounts, watched that outpouring with a complicated mixture of grief for a woman she had once mentored and something closer to bewilderment at its scale, having spent her own entire adult life absorbing public scrutiny and criticism for choices that, measured against Diana's own, were in several respects considerably less consequential to the institution. She is reported to have remarked privately, in terms more than one biographer has recorded in slightly different phrasing but consistent substance, that she had never received anything close to that kind of public sympathy for her own far longer history of sacrifice. A comment that reads less as jealousy toward a dead woman than as a lifetime's accumulated exhaustion, finally finding a moment blunt enough to say so out loud. The first stroke came in February 1998, while Margaret was staying at her house on Mystique, a mild episode by the standard of what would follow, but serious enough to require hospital treatment, and to mark, for anyone paying close attention to the pattern of her public appearances afterward, the beginning of a visible physical decline. The following year brought a far more dramatic injury, again at Mystique, when Margaret suffered severe scalding to both feet after stepping into an overheated bath, a domestic accident rather than a medical event, but one that left her with mobility problems, serious enough that she was photographed using a cane and later a wheelchair at public engagements, images that stood in stark and unavoidable contrast to the glamorous, endlessly photographed young woman who had toured America in 1965. Then, in March 2001, a further stroke left her with serious vision loss and increased paralysis on one side of her body, reducing her public appearances to a handful of carefully managed occasions. Always accompanied, always seated, the physical vigor that had once made her one of the most photographed women in the world, reduced, in the space of barely 3 years, to a fragility that even the palace's long-standing instinct for discretion could no longer fully soften. The engagements Margaret did keep through these final years grew shorter and rarer with each passing season, and household staff who managed her diary through this period have described a woman determined, against mounting physical limitation, to continue attending at least a handful of the events that mattered most to her personally. Her royal ballet appearances chief among them, arriving by wheelchair to performances she had once attended in the full glamour of the 1960s, applauding a company she had spent decades personally sustaining, long after the cameras had stopped finding her interesting. It is a smaller, less cinematic image than anything else in this story, an old woman in a wheelchair at a ballet performance. And it belongs here anyway, because it is the last version of the pattern that had defined her entire adult life, showing up for the institutions and causes that had never quite defined a formal role for her, doing so on her own diminished terms, largely unwatched by the same press that had once tracked her every movement. Even here, at the very end, the family's decades-old habit of minimal disclosure held firm. Official statements after the 1998 stroke described it, in the studiedly bland language the palace had used for medical news since Colville's era, as a mild episode requiring only a short period of rest. Language that friends and household staff who saw Margaret in the days afterward have since characterized, across several separate accounts, as considerably softer than what they actually observed. The gap between the official language and the private reality was not a lie in any provable sense, and no biographer has ever suggested the palace deliberately misled the public about the severity of Margaret's condition. It was instead the same institutional reflex this video has traced across 5 decades, applied one final time to the body of a woman who could no longer generate the kind of scandal that reflex had originally been built to contain. Proof that the habit itself had long since outlived the specific threat it had been designed to manage. Elizabeth's response to her sister's decline is one of the few chapters in this entire story where the historical record offers something closer to unambiguous warmth rather than careful institutional calculation, and it deserves to be presented that way rather than folded into the same pattern of containment that defined so much of the preceding 4 decades. Household accounts from this period describe the Queen visiting her sister regularly, both at Kensington Palace and during the periods Margaret spent recovering outside London, involving herself personally in decisions about her sister's care in a way that went well beyond what protocol or public expectation required of her. Whatever caution 4 decades of scandal management had trained into Elizabeth's public conduct toward her sister, the private record of these final years shows something that looks a great deal like an older sister returning, almost 70 years after the fact, to the same protective instinct Marion Crawford had described in the nursery on Piccadilly, a woman looking after a younger sibling who could no longer look after herself, stripped now of nearly every institutional consideration that had complicated the relationship for so long. Margaret's final days were spent surrounded by family rather than in isolation, her children David and Sarah both present at points during her last hospitalization. A detailed household accounts have consistently emphasized as evidence that whatever distance the institution had maintained toward her over the decades, the immediate family circle around her at the very end remained genuinely close and present. Margaret died on the 9th of February 2002, 4 days after suffering a further stroke, at King Edward VII's Hospital in London, 71 years old. She had asked, in instructions left well before her final illness, to be cremated rather than buried, a break from the traditional practice of interment that had marked most senior royal funerals for centuries, and her ashes were placed in the royal vault at St. George's Chapel, before later being moved to rest alongside her parents in the King George VI Memorial Chapel, a location that placed her, in death, closer to her father and mother than to the grand state tombs reserved for reigning monarchs. A fittingly modest final resting place for a woman whose entire life had been defined by proximity to power she was never quite permitted to hold in her own right. The funeral took place on the 15th of February, and the date was not chosen carelessly. It fell precisely 50 years to the day after the funeral of King George VI, the father both sisters had lost together in 1952, the event that had set the entire subsequent shape of their relationship in motion, by making one of them a queen and the other, permanently and irreversibly, something else. Whether that scheduling was a deliberate act of remembrance by the family or simply the outcome of practical funeral planning constraints has never been definitively confirmed in any account that has entered the public record, and this video will not pretend to know which explanation is the true one. What can be said with confidence is that the family let the coincidence, if that is what it was, stand without public comment, in keeping with an institutional habit of silence that had governed nearly everything difficult about these two sisters' relationship for the previous half-century. Elizabeth attended the small private service, held largely for family rather than as a state occasion, 7 weeks into what should have been an unambiguously celebratory year, her golden jubilee, and press photographers present outside the chapel captured what several papers described at the time as a rare, visible display of emotion from a monarch famous across her entire reign for showing almost none in public, an image that ran in nearly every next day's coverage, precisely because it was so unusual for her. By every other account, she carried on with the Jubilee's public program in the months that followed, with the same outward composure she had brought to every other collision between personal grief and public duty across her entire reign, a collision that had, in one form or another, defined her relationship with her sister since the day their father died. The Jubilee events that summer went ahead largely as planned: a concert at Buckingham Palace, a service of thanksgiving at St. Paul's Cathedral, tours across the country that echoed, in scale if not in tone, the celebrations of 1977, and Elizabeth attended nearly all of it, carrying the same public face through a summer of national celebration that she had carried through a spring spent burying, within the space of 7 weeks, both her sister and her own mother, who died on the 30th of March that same year, at the age of 101. Before closing the book on this relationship, it is worth widening the frame for a moment, because Margaret's position was not entirely without precedent inside British royal history, and the comparison sharpens exactly what made her situation distinct. Princess Mary, the Princess Royal and only sister of Elizabeth's own father, had occupied a broadly similar role a generation earlier, sister to a reigning king, permanently below him in precedence, without independent constitutional standing of her own. Mary largely accepted the constraints of that position, with a public reserve that generated almost none of the friction Margaret's life would later produce, and the difference between the two women's experiences says as much about changing times as it does about differing temperaments. Mary lived most of her adult life before the tabloid press had developed the appetite and the technology to track a minor royal's every private movement, before paparazzi with long lenses could photograph a private beach from a boat offshore, before television could turn a single unguarded photograph into a national conversation within hours. Margaret was one of the first members of the British royal family to live her entire adult life inside the fully modern media environment that would later consume Diana far more completely, and much of what reads, in hindsight, as Margaret's personal failure to manage her own image was in fact the family's collective failure to understand, quickly enough, that the old rules of discreet royal privacy no longer applied to any of them, Margaret first, and most painfully among them. Charles was not the only one of Elizabeth's children who grew up with a distinct impression of their aunt, and it is worth noting briefly how differently each of them is reported to have experienced her. Anne, closer in temperament to her mother's own briskness and reserve, is described by several household accounts as having a more businesslike relationship with Margaret than a warm one, respectful without any particular closeness. Andrew and Edward, both considerably younger, grew up with Margaret mostly as a colourful, slightly intimidating fixture of family holidays, rather than as any kind of confidant, a great aunt figure, once removed from the day-to-day texture of their own upbringing, despite technically being their aunt, rather than their great-aunt. Only Charles, among the four of them, is consistently described across multiple accounts as having sought her out specifically, as an adult, for exactly the kind of unguarded conversation the rest of the family's careful reserve made difficult to find anywhere else inside the household, which makes his particular closeness to her less a random accident of personality, and more, in its own way, additional evidence for the very pattern this video has been tracing since the beginning. The one member of the family who had spent his own life absorbing outsized public scrutiny for his private choices was, unsurprisingly, the one who found the most to talk about with the family member whose entire adult life had been defined by exactly that same experience a generation earlier. The final complication in this story belongs to the next generation, and it involves the one member of the family who, by multiple accounts, grew closer to Margaret in her later years than to almost anyone else in the household outside his own mother. Charles, Prince of Wales, is widely reported to have developed a particularly warm relationship with his aunt from his own childhood onward, a closeness that deepened considerably after Margaret's divorce from Snowdon and continued through the most difficult years of his own marriage to Diana. Margaret is described, by people close to both of them, as one of the few relatives in whom Charles confided freely during the collapse of his own marriage, a confidant whose own history of forbidden love and institutional constraint gave her, in his eyes, a credibility that most of the rest of the family, Elizabeth included, simply could not offer. That closeness placed Elizabeth in a position with an uncomfortable symmetry to everything else in this story. The sister she had spent 4 decades learning to manage as a risk to the institution had become, without any formal role or title, one of her own son's closest confidants during the single most damaging crisis the monarchy would face in the final decades of the Queen's reign, a crisis Elizabeth herself has been widely reported to have found difficult to discuss, even with her own children directly. Whether that arrangement ever registered with Elizabeth as its own small, particular irony, a sister she trusted less than almost anyone in the family had become the person her own son trusted most, is not something the historical record settles one way or the other, and this video will leave it exactly as unresolved as the sources leave it. It is worth setting Britain's handling of this problem against how other European monarchies managed comparable situations during the same decades, if only because the comparison shows how much of what happened to Margaret was a specifically British institutional choice, rather than an unavoidable feature of royal life anywhere in the world. Monaco's Princess Caroline, coming of age in a much smaller and more informally run court during the 1970s and 80s, was permitted a level of personal freedom in her romantic life that would have been unthinkable for Margaret a generation earlier, including her own eventual divorce, without anything like the sustained parliamentary campaign Willie Hamilton waged against Margaret for a decade. The Spanish and Belgian royal households, restored or re-established after periods of republic or occupation, built their own more cautious relationships with the press, specifically in response to watching how badly the British monarchy's exposure of Margaret had gone. Several biographers and royal historians have noted, treating her as a cautionary example of what happens when an old-fashioned court collides with a modern, unrestrained media environment, without adjusting its own rules quickly enough. Britain, in other words, did not merely fail to protect Margaret from an unavoidable historical process. It ran the experiment first, absorbed the damage first, and effectively taught the rest of Europe's surviving monarchies what not to do with the family member the establishment did not quite know what to do with. The civil list argument that had dogged Margaret since the 1960s finally reached its practical resolution in the early 1990s, not through any single dramatic reform, but through a quieter restructuring the palace had been moving toward for years. Facing continued public pressure over the cost of supporting the wider family, the Queen agreed to a new arrangement in which she herself would personally fund several relatives, Margaret included, out of her own private income rather than through direct public funding, removing the annual parliamentary argument that Willie Hamilton and his successors had kept alive for 2 decades by taking it, quite literally, out of public hands and into Elizabeth's own. It was, in its own understated way, one of the clearest single acts of practical loyalty Elizabeth extended to her sister across the entire second half of their lives, a decision that cost the Queen personally in order to end, once and for all, the the specific public argument that had embarrassed them both for a generation. It also fit the pattern this entire video has traced from the beginning. Elizabeth's love for her sister kept expressing itself through management and containment, even at its most generous, solving the problem privately and structurally, rather than ever making the underlying tension between them a matter of public discussion. That instinct toward private containment was tested harder than at almost any other point in the Queen's reign during 1992, the year she herself would later describe, in a speech delivered at the Guildhall in London, as an annus horribilis, a phrase that entered the permanent vocabulary of British public life almost as soon as she used it. A fire tore through Windsor Castle that November, destroying or damaging more than 100 rooms and forcing an uncomfortable public debate about who should pay for the restoration. 3 of the Queen's own 4 children saw their marriages collapse or come under open public strain within the same 12 months, Charles and Diana's included. The marriage whose slow public disintegration Margaret herself had watched from unusually close range, given her friendship with Diana in the earlier years. Against that backdrop, an institution already absorbing more bad news in a single year than in almost any other period of the post-war monarchy had even less appetite than usual for a fresh crisis originating from Margaret, and courtiers from the period have described a household stretched thin enough that Margaret's own continuing health concerns, still several years from becoming public in any serious way, were handled with an economy of attention that reflected just how much else the family was managing at the same time. Elizabeth's caution toward her sister, in other words, was never simply about Margaret in isolation. It existed inside a wider, lifelong pattern of an institution and a woman who had learned, across 4 decades and multiple genuine crises, that containment was very often the only tool available that actually worked. Diana's death in 1997 and the wave of public grief and criticism of the family's initial muted response that followed it forced the monarchy into the single largest public relations reckoning of Elizabeth's entire reign, a reckoning that produced a visibly more emotionally forthcoming, more media-conscious royal household in the years that followed. It is worth asking, briefly, whether that late education came too late to have changed anything about how Margaret herself had been managed across the preceding 4 decades, and the honest answer is that it almost certainly did. Margaret's own health was already in serious decline by the time the post-Diana reforms took hold, and whatever lessons the institution learned about warmth, transparency, and emotional accessibility in the final years of the 1990s arrived only in time to shape how the family handled her funeral, not how it had handled her entire adult life. The pattern this video has spent so long documenting was, by the time anyone in the family seriously reconsidered it, already a permanent fact of Margaret's biography, rather than something that could still be revised. Press coverage across Margaret's entire adult life kept reaching for the same handful of labels to describe her: the rebel princess, the people's princess. Before that phrase attached itself permanently to Diana instead, the black sheep, shorthand that flattened 5 decades of genuine complexity into a single marketable persona. And that persona has proven strikingly durable even after her death, resurfacing in stage plays, in prestige television dramatizations that introduced her story to audiences born decades after the Townsend affair, in gallery retrospectives of Snowdon's own photography that inevitably circle back to the marriage that produced it. None of that popular afterlife has done much to correct the fairy tale version of this relationship this video opened by rejecting, and if anything, the dramatized retellings have often leaned further into the sentimental reading, the loyal sister who sacrificed everything and got nothing back but scandal and pity, because that version makes for better television than the messier, more ambivalent truth the documented record actually supports. Elizabeth herself outlived her sister by 20 years, dying in September 2022 after a reign of 70 years, and the flood of retrospective coverage that followed her own death inevitably circled back to Margaret as one of the defining relationships of that long reign, a fact that says something about how central this particular sisterhood remains to any honest accounting of what the modern British monarchy actually is and how it actually operates. Obituary writers who had spent decades covering the family reached, almost uniformly, for the same complicated language this video has tried to earn rather than assume, describing a bond that was genuine, lifelong, and never quite as simple as either the dutiful Queen narrative or the tragic sister narrative had made it seem. That convergence, arriving only after both women were gone, and neither could shape the record any further, is itself a kind of quiet verdict on which version of this story the people who actually studied it closely came to believe was true. The family itself has a name for the institutional discipline this entire story has been describing. A name George VI is widely credited with coining, and that has stuck in private use ever since, referring to the working monarchy simply as the firm, language borrowed deliberately from the world of business rather than romance or bloodline, an admission, almost startlingly candid for a family so otherwise committed to mystique, that what they were actually running was an institution with a bottom line, a brand, and a set of employees who happened to be relatives. Everything this video has documented about Elizabeth's caution toward Margaret makes considerably more sense once that word is taken seriously rather than treated as a wry aside. A firm protects its brand. A firm manages its liabilities. A firm does not, as a matter of course, let sentiment override the calculations that keep it solvent, and Elizabeth, whatever the private cost, ran her side of that firm with exactly the discipline the word implies, on her sister's case as much as on any other. It is easy, across a story built so heavily around Margaret's own losses, to lose sight of what Elizabeth herself gave up in order to become the kind of monarch capable of managing a sister at all. She had wanted, by her own reported early wishes, a simpler life than the one the abdication forced onto her family, and from the moment she became queen at 25, she surrendered almost every category of ordinary private experience most people take for granted: spontaneous friendship, unscripted public statements, the ability to disagree openly with her own government, even the small freedom of choosing how to spend an unstructured afternoon. She built her entire adult identity around a discipline of self-restraint, so complete that biographers still struggle, 70 years into her reign, to identify with any confidence what she actually thought about most of the defining events of her own life, Margaret's marriages included. Measured against that standard, Elizabeth's caution toward her sister looks less like a unique failure of sisterly loyalty and more like the same instrument, self-discipline in service of institutional continuity, that she applied to literally everything else in her life, herself most of all. That does not make Margaret's experience of that discipline any less painful. It does mean the sister who wielded it had paid, in her own currency, a price at least as steep as the one she was asking Margaret to keep paying. Robert Lacey, whose decades of writing on Elizabeth's reign have often focused on the mechanics of the institution itself rather than personal psychology, frames the entire relationship in more explicitly structural terms than any of the other biographers this video has drawn on, arguing that the monarchy by its nature requires exactly one member of any given generation to absorb the discipline of the crown, while everyone else in that generation is left to improvise a role for themselves, with no rulebook and no guaranteed reward for good behavior, a structural imbalance that would have produced friction between any two siblings placed on either side of it, Elizabeth and Margaret included, almost regardless of their individual personalities. So where does that leave the question this video opened with? The question of whether Elizabeth secretly distrusted her own sister. The honest answer, built from everything the historical record actually supports, rather than from the version of this story that gets repeated at every royal anniversary, is that distrust is both the right word and an incomplete one. Sarah Bradford, whose biography of Elizabeth drew on decades of access to people inside the household, describes a queen whose caution toward Margaret was never personal in the sense of resentment or dislike, but was instead a form of institutional discipline so thoroughly internalized that it applied to her own sister exactly as it applied to ministers, bishops, and heads of state, an inability to fully separate the private woman from the public risk she represented. Ben Pimlott's biography takes a related but distinct position, going that Elizabeth's reserve toward Margaret was less a considered policy than a simple extension of her own basic temperament, a woman who managed every difficult relationship in her life, not only the one with her sister, through distance and duty rather than open confrontation, which would make Margaret's experience less a unique punishment and more one particularly painful instance of how Elizabeth handled closeness in general. Craig Brown, Working from the widest single collection of anecdotal testimony about Margaret's private life ever assembled, resists offering a single tidy verdict at all, presenting instead a portrait built from dozens of contradictory fragments, a woman capable of real cruelty and real generosity within the same afternoon, and by extension, a relationship with her sister that likely contained exactly that same contradiction stretched across 5 decades rather than a single afternoon. Christopher Warwick, closest of any of these biographers to Margaret's own circle, remains the most insistent that the burden of proof runs the other way entirely, that an institution which gave one sister a throne and the other sister nothing but a title and a lifetime of scrutiny has very little standing to complain about how that second sister eventually behaved. None of these 4 readings actually contradicts the others in the way a courtroom verdict would require. They describe the same set of facts from 4 different distances, and the truest account of what passed between Elizabeth and Margaret probably has to hold all 4 at once. A caution that was institutional and also personal, a distance that was disciplined, and also simply Elizabeth's basic nature, a genuine, deep and real love that coexisted, without ever fully resolving, with a genuine and equally real wariness. What the entire documented record refuses to support, however it gets told in the more sentimental retrospectives, is the version of this story in which Margaret's sacrifice over Townsend was simply repaid, decades later, with her sister's unwavering loyalty and trust. It was not. It was repaid with love that never disappeared, and trust that, scandal by scandal, year by year, kept shrinking anyway. 2 things the family itself never had to choose between openly, because the household's entire operating instinct, learned first from Crawfey's banishment, and practiced for the following 50 years on every subsequent crisis, was never to choose openly between anything if the choice could instead be managed, minimized, and quietly absorbed. That is why the image of the 15th of February 2002, an old queen sitting through a small, private funeral, exactly 50 years after she buried her father, on the same date, in the same chapel, for a sister whose life had been permanently reshaped by the same death, carries the weight it does. No fairy tale ends this way. 2 women who never stopped loving each other and who also, across 5 decades of coronations, renunciations, marriages, divorces, scandals, and slow physical decline, never fully found their way back to trusting each other the way they had before a crown and a church and a government first stepped between them in 1952. That is simply what happened, the far more human and far less tidy outcome the fairy tale version of this story was never built to hold. If this is the version of royal history you actually want, the one that resists the easy sentimental gloss and follows the documented record wherever it actually leads, even into the uncomfortable places the official version prefers to leave alone, then subscribe to this channel now, because there are more stories exactly like this one still to come. Stories about the family whose public face has always been more carefully constructed than its private history, and the next one is already waiting for you.